Chapter 1356. Feng Ling, don't go. It's too dangerous. Accompanied by Tam and Lin Cheng's shouts, the helicopter had already smashed into the ground. It was only about 10 meters away from the little girl on the ground. Seeing that the helicopter was about to crash and die, Feng Ling's figure had already nimbly leaped over. She picked up the little girl on the ground and pounced toward the haystack by the side, without any regard for anything else. Feng Ling's speed was not as fast as when she was in the base, but it was not slow either. At the very least, when she held the little girl in her arms and pressed her against the haystack, she heard the sound of the helicopter crashing behind her. It was enough to prove that she had really saved her. The little girl in her arms was crying. Feng Ling quickly turned back and saw that the place where the plane landed was exactly where the little girl had fallen. A loud explosion rang in her ears, and the earth seemed to tremble crazily at this moment. Feng Ling patted the little girl in her arms. The little girl was already scared silly. She raised her head in her arms. "Close your eyes," Feng Ling said softly. Feng Ling said in a low voice, and picked up the little girl again. When she turned around, she saw a dazzling fire in front of her. When the plane crashed and exploded, the second explosion and the soaring flames were inevitable. Precisely because of this, the surrounding people were still fleeing in panic. Feng Ling closed her eyes from the thick smoke and quickly retreated with the little girl, who did not understand her words, in her arms. Tam suddenly rushed over and rushed to Feng Ling under the flames. He opened the car door and shouted, "Hurry up and get in." Feng Ling carried the little girl into the car, and the off-road vehicle quickly drove away, leaving this dangerous area. Even after bringing the girl to a safe area, Feng Ling still coughed a few times in the car. "Are you all right?" Lin Cheng sat in the front passenger seat and handed her a bottle of water. Feng Ling took the water and turned to look at the child who had been crying in fright. She brought the water to her mouth and didn't know which country she was from. She whispered into her ear and tried to ask in the languages she knew. In the end, she confirmed that she seemed to be a child from a British family. After comforting the child, she quickly called Tam to drive the car to the British Embassy in Jerusalem and temporarily handed the child over. She didn't know when the child's parents would come to find her. After instructing the child, Feng Ling walked out of the embassy. Her throat was very uncomfortable. She went to the car to get a bottle of water. After drinking a few sips, she felt much better. At the same time, the hand holding the water bottle paused. She abruptly raised her eyes to look at Tam. "Where was the accident between Kay and Bosley? You said there's a river nearby, didn't you?" "They had an accident about 40 kilometers away from here. There is indeed a river there. I choked on the smoke from the explosion when the plane crashed. My throat has been dry and painful. In the area where the chemical detonated, if they still had a chance of survival, they would definitely choose the water route," Feng Ling said as she quickly got into the car. "Let's go take a look." Feng has already thought about this. He has already sent people to search along the river. But at the end of the river is a very high waterfall cliff. Tam's voice became hoarse. "If it's there, there's no chance of survival. Even if we firmly believe that Boss and Kay are still alive, we can only choose another route. The water route is definitely no longer feasible." "It works." Feng Ling directly capped the mineral water bottle again and went to the driver's seat. She looked at the two people outside the car. "Or rent another car. You guys go by land. I'll go by water." "That definitely won't work. I can't let you go alone," Lin Cheng said and jumped into the back seat. "Let's go to the water route to take a look, in case there really is a miracle." Tam no longer had any objections. He got into the car, but when he sat in the front passenger seat, he glanced at Feng Ling. "I'll drive." "It's fine. You've been driving all the way. Rest for a while. We'll take turns." Feng Ling looked at the road ahead. It was barren everywhere. The sunlight was bright and dazzling. She took the sunglasses from Tam and put them on. Tam looked at her by the side. "Aren't these sunglasses a little big for you?" It was indeed a little big, but Feng Ling had long hair tied behind her head. Her eyes and legs could be pinned to her hair and wouldn't fall off for the time being. "It's fine. It's much better than the sunlight." As Feng Ling spoke, she reached out to search for the direction on the navigator and pointed at the red dot on it. It's here, right? Yes, boss's accident happened here, but so many days have passed. If he's still alive, he must be very far away, Tam said. Let's get there first, then slowly search along the waterway and the surroundings. Feng Ling quickly stepped on the accelerator, according to the direction of the navigation. At the same time, she said, contact the base and see what routes they've searched before. Don't waste time. Don't repeat the useless route. We've already fallen out with the base. We came out on our own. How could the base? Can't you ask a few people you're close to in private? If you put this kind of thing on the table, not to mention Ah Feng, even if boss is in the base, the result will be the same. However, a human life is at stake. Even if you contact Ah Feng in private, he will still tell you. Feng Ling frowned. Lin Cheng paused for a moment, and quickly picked up his phone to contact the people at the base. In the end, it was indeed the electronic map that Ah Feng had sent them. All the routes marked in red were the ones that they had sent people to search, and the locations were all there. As Feng Ling drove, she listened to the route that Tam and Lin Cheng were talking about. She controlled the steering wheel with one hand, and quickly marked the navigation on the car with the other. She could mark almost all the locations that the two of them mentioned at the same time. In the end, all of them appeared on the navigation device. The waterway. The location they're looking for ends in the area of the waterfall, Feng Ling said as she drove. When we pass by a car rental place later, let's rent 2 more cars. We'll split into 3 groups. I'll go to the waterfall. You guys go to the other 2 unexplored routes. That place is too dangerous. How can I let you go? Below the waterfall is an ancient jungle. Have you lived in the jungle before? Feng Ling asked. I'll go myself. You guys go to the other routes. Listen to me. Even though Feng Ling was no different from before, her tone had more or less become a high-ranking leader. She could not be refused. I'll go by water. You guys choose these 2 routes. We'll meet at the final location in 48 hours. She wanted to talk about, young Master Mo. Have you kissed enough, with more like-minded people? Talk about life and find a confidant W. 4M. Chapter 1357. Feng Ling drove alone in the direction of the river near where Li Nanhing disappeared. This was no longer the urban area of Jerusalem, but it was even more chaotic than the urban area. Feng Ling's car was like an arrow's bowstring. She kept roaring forward, but there was another huge explosion behind her. It was even louder than what she had experienced in the urban area. A huge force almost overturned her car. Her ears were buzzing, and her eardrums were hurting uncomfortably. Feng Ling's hands were still holding the steering wheel steadily. In the end, she still quickly escaped. This area was not like the city, where there was a quarantine zone. There were broken walls and debris everywhere. The huge explosion behind them was the sound of a plane falling from an unknown place. This should be the explosion zone that they said was filled with a lot of chemicals, because the ground here was no longer yellow-less, but charred black. There was even a strange substance mixed in the black, like some kind of chemical substance condensed in the air, and fell on the hot ground at that time, condensing into tiny grayish-green ice crystals. Seeing the black ground, Feng Ling suddenly stopped the car, got out of the car to carefully observe those things, and then checked for any suspicious existences nearby. When she walked to the river, she saw that the place where the weeds should have been growing was now black and bare. She gently touched it with her foot, and some charred black things fell into the river. She turned back, picked up a stone, and threw it into the river. After checking the depth of the water in the river, Feng Ling turned her gaze downstream, which was the direction of the waterfall they mentioned. It wasn't that the people from the base hadn't come to rescue them, and the base wouldn't give up on any possibility of K and Li Nanhing surviving. They sent people several times, but the result was the same. They couldn't find any trace of them. The final conclusion was that the chemicals might have corrosive effects, and it was so hot here. Anything was possible. Perhaps after searching for so many days, they had only found 2 bodies that had long since rotted. Moreover, if they had really fallen into the river, they would have fallen into a very ancient jungle along the waterfall downstream. That kind of ancient jungle was not a place that ordinary people could enter. There might be all kinds of rare beasts, And this kind of jungle was not a place that could be survived by just learning some survival skills in the wild. Not to mention that there were beasts everywhere. There might even be some messy man-eating flowers. There were all kinds of poisonous plants on the ground at any time, and they would die at the sight of blood. At that time, even if Boss Lee and Kay were really lucky enough to survive falling down the waterfall, after so many days in the jungle below, there was no possibility of them surviving. The people in the base went from searching around urgently at the beginning to gradually having no choice but to face reality. In the end, they had no choice but to withdraw all their combat power to prevent further casualties. According to Lin Chung and Tam, this process lasted for about 4 to 5 days. 4 to 5 days. Seriously injured. Ancient jungle. The chance of survival had dropped from 1% to 0. 1%. However, there was a strong force that told Feng Ling. How could a man like him die just like that? How could he disappear from this world just like that? He was still alive. Li Nanheng must be waiting for her somewhere. After looking at all the charred areas on the ground, Feng Ling used a cut mineral water bottle to take some of the soil away. She placed it in the car and drove downstream. During this time, Tam called her and asked if she was safe. After exhorting each other, they continued to search in 3 different directions. The downstream was actually not close to the location of the incident, especially since the 2 sides of the river were not roads that could be driven normally. Even if they drove an off-road vehicle, the road was still very rugged and bumpy. When they arrived at the waterfall, the sky had already darkened. Feng Ling got out of the car and looked around. She then looked down and saw that it was indeed an endless jungle. It seemed that other than going down from the waterfall, there was no other way to go. After all, she did not know where the other side of the jungle was, so she did not know which direction to go. The night was long. Although Israel was a country at war, and everywhere was filled with smoke, the night sky here was relatively clean, and the stars twinkled. Feng Ling took out a bottle of water and a bag of biscuits from the car. She then sat by the waterfall and ate a few bites. She then stood up, patted the biscuit crumbs on her hands, and was about to go to the car to get a coat. At this moment, from the corner of her eye, she suddenly saw a winding river extending into the distance in the dense jungle under the waterfall. It might not be visible during the day, but now, with the moonlight, she could see some fine shadows reflected on the river through the gaps between the leaves. If the bottom of the waterfall was not a dead spring, but a river that extended outside the jungle, then if they really fell from here, they should not be in the jungle. Instead, they should have been washed to the other side of the jungle. When the people from the base came to look for people, they stopped here. And because this was a jungle, they completely put an end to it. But what if they did not stop here at all, and continued to be washed out? Feng Ling quickly got back into the car and searched for the nearby topographic map on the navigator in the car. Usually, the geographical location on the navigator was an important area. For an ancient jungle like this, there would only be one location marked. However, the river here could not be seen, nor was there a river drawn, but at least she could see where the other end of the jungle was. At the end, there was a small patch of blue on the map. At the end of the blue was Gorkin Farm, which was adjacent to Adafira. After setting her target there, Feng Ling closed the car door with a bang and found the route to Gorkin Farm. She found that she could only walk along the desert on both sides of the waterway. The desert was very dangerous, and there was probably no signal. She drove to the signal station closest to Jerusalem, prepared some water and food, and bought 2 power banks and a signal booster. Then, she resolutely went to Gorkin Farm. As she drove along the desert on both sides of the waterway in the middle of the night, she checked everything about Gorkin Farm, but she could not find anything. A farm whose name was shown on the map, but she could not find any specific information. Feng Ling continued to drive forward without hesitation. No matter what, even if Li Nanheng was not there, even if she had to go to other places to search, as long as there was a chance, she could not miss it. Chapter 1358. After driving for an entire night, when they arrived near the Gorkin Farm, the desert in front of them finally turned into a normal-looking farm town. However, this town seemed very barren. It was surrounded by green space, and she could see all kinds of crops. She could also see many people working hard in 2s and 3s. Feng Ling drove the car over and found a young man with dark and yellow skin. She looked at his skin and facial bones, which were typical of this country. She then looked at the others and found that they were all the same. It seemed like the people in this Gorkin farm were all born and raised here, not foreigners from other countries. When the young man saw Feng Ling, he was a little confused. Feng Ling tried to talk to him in English, but the other party clearly did not understand. He turned back to chat and laugh with the old men beside him. In the blink of an eye, he left her here and ignored her. Feng Ling guessed that they might not understand English, but she did not know the language of this country. When she drove past the barren and desolate town of the Gorkin farm, many old people and children watched from the side. Their eyes were filled with fear or curiosity. After all, this was a country at war. Everyone was afraid of any external interference. From the looks of the situation here, it should have been affected by the war. When she passed by earlier, she could see some traces of old smoke and black soil. However, this place should have been peaceful for a long time and had not been disturbed by the war. However, the old people here were still afraid. When they saw such a large unfamiliar SUV drive in, everyone's eyes were filled with various emotions. She could not drive any further, so Feng Ling could only get out of the car. In order not to let these people be wary of her, she took out some biscuits and food from the car and handed them to the children around her. The children were about to come over excitedly, but almost all of them were forcefully pulled back into their arms by the old people. They then pulled the children away with a guarded expression, not allowing them to approach her. Only a skinny, dark-skinned, yellow-skinned boy, who looked like he had no one to take care of him, walked over. He was probably starving. When he saw that she really wanted to give him some biscuits, he quickly took them and stuffed them into his mouth with all his might. Feng Ling looked at him and took out a bottle of water for him. The skinny boy took it and ate the biscuits and water desperately. After he finished the 2 bags of biscuits, he squeezed the mineral water bottle in his hand and looked at her with his bright black eyes. Finally he spoke. However, Feng Ling still couldn't understand the language. She whispered to the boy in English, "Don't you people know any English? Or do you know other languages?" The little boy looked at her for a long time and took another sip of mineral water. Then, he looked at her with his bright black eyes. Feng Ling paused and understood his meaning. She brought him 2 bags of biscuits and 2 bottles of water. The little boy smiled happily and held the food and drinks in his arms. He suddenly said in Chinese that was not very fluent, but could barely be understood by Feng Ling. "Do you know Chinese?" Feng Ling was startled. "I will." The little boy nodded his head vigorously. Suddenly, he pointed at the road in the little town. "There." "What happened there?" "There's a granny who knows Chinese." Hearing this, Feng Ling did not ask more. She nodded at the little boy gratefully and parked the car in an open space that would not affect their entry. Then, she took out some food for the little boy and asked him to watch the car for a while. She then explained that she was not a bad person and would not hurt them. She asked him to tell the people here not to be afraid of her, and then quickly walked in the direction he said. When she arrived outside the house, she did not expect to see a typical red foo character that only China would have in the yard. It looked a little old. It should have been pasted on New Year's Day. Now that many months had passed, the red and black characters had faded from the wind and sun, and it seemed that this character was written by the owner of this place. It was not very beautiful, but at least it was Chinese. Feng Ling knocked on the door. After a long time, about 4 or 5 minutes, a white-haired old man in his 70s walked out. The old man's back was very hunched, and he had to raise his head to look at her. He looked at her for a long time, staring at her skin color and hair. After a long time he said in Chinese in surprise, "You." "Hello, Granny." "Sorry to disturb you," Feng Ling said. "I just heard that there's a granny here who knows Chinese, so I came rashly. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I have something urgent to attend to, so I had no choice but to." Seeing that she was still polite, the old granny nodded and turned unhurriedly. She walked into the yard with her walking stick. "Come in and sit." Feng Ling was very anxious, but seeing that the old granny couldn't rush her, she walked in. Recently, this small farm is really interesting. There's actually another Chinese in a place where there's never been a Chinese. Feng Ling's brows twitched. At this moment, the old granny turned to look at her. What urgent matter do you have? I have a friend who was affected by the battle in Jerusalem and was seriously injured. He must have been washed down the river over there. Everyone thought he was dead. I was unwilling and couldn't accept this result. So I came all the way here and found that the end of the river was actually nearby. Feng Ling paused and reorganized her emotions and words. I guessed that he would be here and wanted to look for him. But the people here don't speak the language, and I can't communicate in English. I didn't expect that there would be a granny who can speak Chinese. I came here when I was very young. The old granny's voice was old, and she still spoke slowly. When I was young, at that time, we didn't have any free love. I was forced to marry by my family, and in a fit of anger I escaped. I used that bit of money to escape to Europe, and then I wandered all the way here. At that time, there were still a lot of people in this Gorkin farm. It was a very prosperous farm, but later on, the wars were too frequent. Some died, and some fled, and it became desolate like this. I married a farmer here, had children and had granddaughters. Just like this, generation after generation, we lived here. Did you come into contact with the wandering children here? Only those children would often come to my place to find food. They only know a little Chinese. Feng Ling nodded. Yes. The old granny nodded, and stood there with her walking stick. After a moment of thought, she said, Is the person you're looking for a man? Chapter 1359. Feng Ling's eyes trembled. She abruptly looked into the old granny's eyes. Granny, you. The old granny raised her hand to signal her not to be anxious. Not long ago, there was indeed a young man who was washed here by the river. He was seriously injured. There aren't any good doctors in this town. I saw that he was unconscious, but he looked Asian. I don't know which country he came from, but I asked someone to send him to an old doctor's house. It's been a few days. I haven't paid attention to him, but he should still be alive. If someone died here, everyone would know. There hasn't been any news for so many days. He should be unconscious, but he's not dead. Where is he? Feng Ling's eyes were filled with gratitude. The old granny saw her anxious look and understood. She did not say much. The doctor doesn't like to communicate with strangers. You don't speak the same language. I'll take you there. Feng Ling was really grateful. She thanked the granny many times, and went forward to support the old granny, walking out with her. This town was not big, but it was not small either. The old granny did not walk fast. Feng Ling was anxious, but she did not urge her. She patiently supported her until they arrived at the doctor's house. Although the old granny came from China, she had lived here for her entire life. She could be considered a respected old woman here. After speaking to the doctor for a while, the doctor used their language to communicate with the old granny for a while, and then let them in. When they walked into the room, the old granny turned back and said to Feng Ling, Your friend's injuries are very serious. He has a broken leg, and seems to have been poisoned by some chemical substance. It has affected a lot of his central nervous system. Although he has woken up, his reaction is slow. He hasn't improved yet. Feng Ling's expression did not change, but her heart tightened. It was so painful that her entire body was emitting a sharp sensation. Did he break a leg? The old granny saw that she did not speak, but her face was much paler. She patted her hand comfortingly. It's inside. Go in and take a look. I'll go greet the people here. They are very wary of outsiders. I'll let them let down their guard against you. Otherwise, it will be inconvenient for you to do anything here. Thank you. After thanking him, Feng Ling quickly walked in. Inside was an old building with the style of a small town in this country. The light was not very bright. When Feng Ling entered, she could smell a strange medicinal smell. The people here seemed to have some Chinese medicine, but she was not sure what it was mixed with. The smell was not very pleasant. After entering, she saw a thin man lying there. Even from here, she could hear his heavy and uncomfortable breathing. Standing in front of the door, Feng Ling immediately recognized him. It was Kay. Feng Ling quickly walked over, leaned over the bed, and looked at the person on the bed. Kay's face was so thin that it was almost unrecognizable. His eyes were lifeless, and it seemed that his reactions were much slower. There was a leg under the quilt, and the other leg was empty. Feng Ling's heart trembled, and her hands were almost unsteady. She forced herself to control her emotions, and looked at the person who seemed to have finally recognized her. Feng Ling. Kay's eyes were very surprised, but his expression was very slow. It seemed that even speaking was very difficult for him. It's me, Kay. Feng Ling's eyes were hot. She quickly took his hand and held it in her hand. You can recognize me. Kay looked at her in a daze, and then as if thinking of something, he suddenly sighed with a smile. I can't believe I can still live see an acquaintance. What nonsense are you talking about? The people in the base have been looking for you everywhere. Even if everyone thinks that there is no chance for you to survive, they have been looking for you. And our sniper team, we also came out to look for you. Didn't I find you now? Feng Ling clenched his hand tightly. It doesn't matter if you have a broken leg, as long as you are still alive. There are also many members in our base who were seriously injured during missions. Look, aren't they still in the base? As long as you are alive, it doesn't matter. You don't have to comfort me. Kay smiled weakly and then frowned. Right now, there is no difference between being alive and being dead. Don't talk nonsense. Kay looked at her again and thought of something. His eyes suddenly dimmed. Have you found boss? Feng Ling couldn't hold back the smile that she forced out of her eyes just now. She collapsed and her expression was a little stiff. Looking at her expression, Kay sighed and closed his eyes. It's all my fault. Originally, boss could have escaped. He did it to save me. Then at the waterfall, boss caught me, but we were too weak. I asked him to let go, but he didn't let go. Boss fell down with me. At that time, boss was more seriously injured than me. After falling down, I don't know if the two of us were washed out by that river together. At that time, the river was too turbulent, and boss and I both fainted. Later, I don't know why I woke up in this place. I don't understand the people here, but it seems that they saved me. But I can't ask where boss is. Since you can find me, have you found boss? Kay almost used all his strength to barely say these coherent words. He held Feng Ling's hand tightly, only hoping to hear good news. Sure enough, he was washed down by the waterfall. But if this was the case, he might have died in the turbulent river in the jungle, or he might have been blocked by some stones or water plants in the water and failed to be washed out. Or, there were all kinds of possibilities. Feng Ling endured the pain of being cut by a knife all over her body and heart, and slowly, she shook her head. Kay instantly closed his eyes in pain. It's all my fault. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have been so impulsive, and boss wouldn't have. All right, don't say this. It's enough that he is still alive. Feng Ling held his hand. I will look for him. Do you remember Roger's Snow Mountain? At that time, there was almost no chance of survival in that ice cave. But he came out. His vitality and perseverance don't allow him to die. I will find him. Don't worry. Take good care of your wounds and don't think too much. Kay looked at him with reddened eyes. Feng Ling said coldly. Don't tell me how serious his injuries were. Since you're still alive, he can also survive. Even if it's more serious than yours. Even if his limbs are broken. Even if he's crippled. I'll still find him and bring him back. Kay choked with sobs and couldn't speak for a long time. He just closed his eyes and nodded. Chapter 1360. Tam and Lin Qing met up at the place they had agreed on, but they didn't see Feng Ling. It wasn't easy for them to contact her when their phones finally had a signal. After all, there were people living in the Gorkin farm where Feng Ling was. Although the cell phone signal here was weak, it could at least keep in touch with them. After explaining the situation here, Tam and Lin Qing were overjoyed and saddened at the same time. They were happy that they had found Kay. Their brother was still alive. Even if he had lost a leg, his brother was here. They had to bring him back to Los Angeles. The sad thing was that in a place like the Gorkin farm, this was their last chance of survival. But there was no news of Boss Lee. If it was really as Feng Ling had said on the phone, the worst outcome would be that after Li Nanheng came down from the waterfall, he would be intercepted in the river in the ancient jungle when he was washed away in the river. Kay, who was near the Gorkin farm, could at least be rescued. If he was intercepted in the jungle, with Li Nanheng's body covered in injuries, he would only attract beasts that came to hunt for prey. If that was really the case, not to mention the possibility of survival, he probably wouldn't even have a complete corpse. Tam and Lin Cheng planned to come to the Gorkin farm, but just as they were about to drive over, the area near Jerusalem was under martial law because of the terrorist attacks in the past 2 days. The martial law extended all the way to their current location, and they were not allowed to leave Jerusalem. Feng Ling reported to them that she was safe and said that she would stay here to take care of Kay. She told them not to worry and to wait for her to return. She also promised to keep in touch with them. They had no choice. Right now, they were under martial law and could not come out for the time being. They could only wait there anxiously. Kay woke up after a nap. Feng Ling went to the bed to help him up and prepared to feed him medicine. When she helped him up, she touched Kay's shoulder and could clearly feel how much he had lost in the past few days. His shoulders, which used to be very strong, were now so thin that she could easily feel his bones. "Come, take the medicine," Feng Ling said softly. Kay seemed to be in a daze. After a long time, he looked at the light outside the window. After a while he slowly said, "Is it another day?" "Yes. Still haven't found boss." "No." Feng Ling's expression was impassive. She lowered her head to blow at the medicine in the bowl. "The doctor here uses some local medicine. I don't know what it is, but since he can save your life, it means that their medicine is also useful. It just doesn't smell good. Bear with it and drink all of this." Kay closed his eyes and leaned back against her shoulder. "I'm fine. There's no taste in my mouth right now. I can't feel whether it's sweet, salty, or bitter." The Chinese mother-in-law had asked the doctor for her, and the doctor said that Kay was poisoned by a chemical. They didn't know what kind of chemical it was, but it could affect one's 5 senses. He only lost his sense of taste, and his reaction was slow, which was already not bad. It was much better than being mute, blind, and deaf. Because they didn't know what kind of poison it was, there was no way to treat it. They didn't know if he would have a chance to recover in the future. In short, what they had to do now was to let him recover and save his life first. Feng Ling carefully fed Kay the medicine. Kay had to use all his strength to drink a bowl of medicine, even if he was sitting on the bed. In the end, he sat there weakly and looked at Feng Ling. For convenience, she specially asked for a long cloth from the old lady and tied her long hair behind her head. Because she didn't change her clothes last night, the old lady brought her a set of local cotton linen clothes. It was light blue and looked very good on her. "Feng Ling, you've really changed a lot." Kay tried his best to widen his listless eyes and looked at her. "In the past, when you were in the base, and now, you're really 2 different people." Feng Ling lowered her head, put down the medicine bowl, and then quickly wiped the medicine stains on his mouth with a towel. "Other than the appearance, what else is different?" "Your eyes." Kay slowly curved his lips. "You may not feel it, but really your eyes have changed a lot." "Really? In the past your eyes were very clean. In your world, there was only one goal: to live well. Later there were feelings, warmth, and things you cared about in your eyes. Later, after you returned to the Feng family, there were many things holding you back. Your eyes were filled with the struggle, helplessness, depression, and forbearance that all normal people would have. Although you're still the same you've changed a lot. At least, you're no longer the little Feng Ling, who was inexperienced in the world." Feng Ling sneered. "You're only a few years older than me, and you say I'm inexperienced?" Kay also smiled. "I'm just older than you. Look, we were still teenagers back then, but now we're all grown up." Feng Ling curved her lips. "All right, let's not talk about the past. Rest well. I'll go out for a walk." Kay knew that she wanted to go out to see if there was any possibility of finding Li Nanheng, so he did not force her to stay. He only said, "Be careful." After leaving the place where Kay and the doctor lived, Feng Ling drove around the Gorkin farm. Today was the 2nd day she had been here. It was already evening. There were many locals washing things near the river in front of them. The way of life of the people here was very ancient and simple. Their water source was this river, so when Kay was washed here, he was immediately discovered. She could not drive any closer. Feng Ling parked the car in the open space by the Gorkin farm town and walked over. She saw someone washing clothes by the water. When she turned back, she saw a young girl in her 20s washing things. There seemed to be a lot of blood on her clothes. Looking at the bloodstains, Feng Ling subconsciously walked over. However, when the girl saw someone approaching, she suddenly raised her eyes to look at her. Seeing that it was a stranger who did not look like a local, she immediately lowered her head warily. She put the unwashed clothes into the basin and turned to wash them in a place further away. Feng Ling saw that she did not seem to want to be approached, so she did not go over. She only looked at the young girl from afar. This girl looked like she was mixed race. But didn't the China mother-in-law say that she had already greeted the people here, and that they would no longer be wary of her? Why did this girl seem to be carefully guarding against something? Chapter 1361. Feng Ling drove around the river overnight and went to the jungle. She found that this jungle was really different from the jungle she had lived in when she was young. One was near the sea, but it was still a jungle close to the beach. No matter what, it wouldn't be as dangerous as the ancient jungle. For example, the jungle in front of her was indeed as they said. There might be all kinds of things that ordinary people had never seen or heard of in their lives, be it objects or living creatures. She wandered outside for half a night and tried to use the flashlight to shine inside. Several times, she wanted to go in, but her rationality told her that this jungle wasn't something she could barge into. However, if Li Nanheng was really inside, if she wanted to go in, she had to ensure that every step was foolproof. She couldn't drive in. At the very least, she had to be fully prepared. Feng Ling stayed outside until late at night, before returning to Gorkin farm. In the middle of the night, Kay was still sleeping. After visiting Kay, Feng Ling returned to her mother-in-law's place in China. The China mother-in-law's surname was Mai. The people here called her by her name. If Feng Ling wasn't used to it, she could call her Granny Mai. Feng Ling didn't want to disturb Granny Mai late at night. She could sleep in the car for the night, but she had to prepare the things she needed to enter the jungle. The longer she delayed, the more uneasy she felt. She decided to return to her mother-in-law's place and prepare things for herself overnight. Thankfully, Granny Mai slept soundly and didn't disturb her. It wasn't until 4 in the morning that Granny Mai woke up and saw Feng Ling sitting in the yard cutting something with a knife. She walked out to see her. "Are you preparing to enter the jungle?" What are you cutting?" "It's nothing. I just found some sturdy bamboo and sticks to make something for myself to defend myself. After I'm done, I'll put it in the car. I'll need it." Feng Ling was still seriously cutting and spoke without raising her head. Granny Mai looked at her for a while and sighed. She walked over and sat down beside her. "Child, listen to Granny's advice. There's no way to return from that ancient jungle. Don't go. You're such a good child. Granny doesn't want you to." Feng Ling did not explain much. She asked her about the Gorkin farm, as well as if there were any other rivers, water sources, and other places that she could change her target. However, the answer she received was no. The Gorkin farm was at the end of the river. If Kay and Li Nanheng had been washed here, as long as they were not intercepted in the middle of the river, they would definitely have reached this place. There would not have been any other place. Feng Ling completely dispelled her other thoughts and nodded without saying anything. Just as the sky gradually brightened, the doctor suddenly sent news that Kay had a seizure. It was probably because of what happened before and after the accident that he kept having nightmares. Right now, he was not very awake and had been desperately trying to get out of bed. He fell off the bed several times and hit anyone he saw. He was in a very bad state. Hearing this, Feng Ling quickly put down the things in her hands and rushed to the doctor. When she arrived, Kay was still sitting on the ground by the bed, going crazy. Feng Ling quickly rushed over to talk to him and told him many things about Kay's past. Only then did he gradually calm down. In the end, he was finally willing to be helped back to the bed by her. He had recovered from the fright, and his twitching body gradually calmed down. Kay was in such a state and could not leave his side for the time being. The doctor asked her to stay here to guard him, although Feng Ling was anxious to go to the jungle to look for Li Nanheng. Seeing that Kay was in such a state, she could not leave. She could only sit by the bed and guard him. In the morning, Granny Mai tidied up the things that Feng Ling had cut in the courtyard and placed them on the stone table in the courtyard. At this moment, a young girl suddenly walked in. "Grandma, I forgot how to add water to the Chinese porridge you taught me before. Quickly teach me again." Granny Mai looked at Granny Mai. The girl who came was Granny Mai's granddaughter Carrie. She was only 22 years old this year. Their family had a lot of residences in the Gorkin farm. Carrie had long moved to a new yard by herself. She grew flowers and grass on her own and lived a carefree life. This granddaughter was usually obedient and considerate, so Granny Mai did not worry too much. "Don't you like Chinese-style porridge? Why do you suddenly want to make porridge?" Granny Mai asked in confusion. Carrie did not explain. She walked in and found the kitchen. She took out the pot and the white rice from Granny Mai and walked to the yard to show her. "Grandma, I'll take the white rice here first. If you can still receive white rice in the next few days, remember to leave 2 bags for me." Granny Mai was even more puzzled. Before she could speak, she heard Carrie muttering softly as she added water to the pot in the yard. "It shouldn't be a problem to have more water, right? His injuries are so serious. The thicker the liquid food, the better." Although Granny Mai was old, her hearing was very good. She immediately glanced at her, but when she saw that Carrie was only muttering softly, she did not say much. She took the white rice and asked how much water she needed to add. Then, she took the white rice and pot and left with a worried expression. She knew her granddaughter very well. This child had been very obedient since she was young and never lied. When she was young, she would hide her gaze from adults because she had secretly eaten a piece of candy. Just now, Carrie's gaze was a little evasive. Granny Mai did not say anything. She tidied up the things in the yard and suddenly recalled that the friend Feng Ling was looking for did not seem to be the young man named Kay, who was currently with the doctor, but someone else. In the afternoon, seeing that Feng Ling was still at Kay's place, Granny Mai first went to the doctor to ask about the situation. When she learned that Feng Ling was still guarding Kay, she did not say anything and went straight to her granddaughter Carrie's place. Carrie's yard was very clean, and there were many flowers she liked planted in the yard. However, in her yard, there were a few washed towels, gauze and men's clothes on the drying rack that usually only had 1 or 2 beautiful linen dresses hanging on it. Seeing that there were men's clothes, Granny Mai's expression instantly turned cold. She walked in with her walking stick. Coincidentally, Carrie came out with a basin of blood-stained bedsheets. When she suddenly saw her grandmother, her expression froze in fright, and she quickly closed the door behind her. "Carrie, tell Grandma, are you hiding someone here?" Granny Mai walked over with a frown and looked at her granddaughter sternly. Carrie bit her lip and turned to look at the things on the drying rack. She then looked at the blood-stained bedsheets in the basin in her arms and knew that she could no longer hide it. She quickly explained, "Grandma, didn't we save someone at the river that day? Later, when I went to wash the clothes at night, I saw another person lying on the grass by the river bank." Chapter 1362. Feng Ling was still at Kay's place. Tam and Lin Cheng called several times. She said that she could hold on, but in fact, after returning from the jungle last night, she was a little exhausted. She was afraid that Li Nanheng was really inside. She would rather go in and find nothing. As long as he was not intercepted by the water grass in the river in the jungle, as long as he had other chances of survival, she was willing to go into the jungle and never return. Seeing that Kay was still having nightmares in his sleep and clutching the blanket from time to time, Feng Ling placed her hand on Kay's body and gently patted him. She lowered her head several times to comfort him warmly, pulling him back to reality from his nightmares. The doctor came in again, gave her the medicine, and asked her to feed it to Kay. During the feeding, Kay woke up. His eyes were a little blurry. Feng Ling coaxed and comforted him before feeding him all the medicine. In the end, there was only a little left. He really couldn't eat anymore. She held the medicine bowl with one hand and took a towel with the other to wipe his mouth. At this moment, Granny Mai walked in with her walking stick. When she came in, she saw that she was still taking care of Kay. She suddenly recalled what she had just learned from Carrie, and couldn't help but sigh. Granny! Feng Ling turned back to see that it was Granny Mai. She quickly turned back. You didn't throw away the things I made this morning, did you? No, I've tidied them up and placed them in the yard, but I feel that you might not need them. Granny Mai hesitated for a moment. Although her granddaughter had specially begged her not to tell anyone, she couldn't watch Feng Ling die in the jungle to find her friend. She sighed and said, At that time, there was another person who was washed over by the river with your friend called Kay. Feng Ling's hand that was gripping the edge of the medicine bowl tightened. She abruptly raised her eyes to look at her mother-in-law. But we didn't find that person, and only saved this one. Later, when my granddaughter, Carrie, went to the river to wash clothes, she found that person. At that time, he was also on the verge of death. It's also my fault. I've always spoiled my granddaughter too much, so her personality has become so bold and willful. In the past few years, she has learned some medical skills from the doctor in this town, but she's not very good. However, she felt that the doctor could save Kay, so she picked up another person and brought him back. She could also save him. She quietly brought him back to her place. After so many days, I actually didn't notice. I only found out today. Feng Ling's expression changed from a daze to a light in her eyes. You only found out today. You mean that person is still alive? Granny Mai hesitated for a moment before saying, I didn't see him. Carrie said that she did save that person's life, but that person was the same as your friend. He seemed to have been poisoned by chemicals, and only woke up after a few days. Although he's awake now, his body is severely injured and he's very weak. Although he's not crippled or broken, he can't see. At this moment, Kay vaguely heard Granny Mai's voice. He slowly opened his eyes and turned to look in their direction. He was no longer shocked and looked much calmer. He looked at Granny Mai and then at Feng Ling, who was standing by the bed. Feng Ling. Feng Ling's fingers that were pinching the edge of the bowl almost turned white. Under those circumstances, he fell down the waterfall at the same time as Kay, and was washed here. They both had symptoms of chemical poisoning. Other than Li Nanheng, there was no one else. He was still alive. He was not eaten by wild beasts in the jungle. He was still alive. His eyes can't see. What do you mean? Kay lay on the bed and said hoarsely. However, before he could finish his words, Feng Ling suddenly put down the medicine bowl in her hand and walked out. As she walked, she said, Granny, take me to him. Seeing that Feng Ling was so anxious, Granny Mai sighed, nodded and turned to walk out. However, because her legs were really slow, and seeing that Feng Ling was really anxious this time, she simply pointed the way for her. It's at my granddaughter Carrie's place. I'm walking too slowly. You can go there by yourself first. It's just ahead where I live. On the right side of the road opposite, there's a courtyard with many flowers. It's her place. The clothes you see hanging in the courtyard should be your friend. If there's no mistake, it should be the person you're looking for. Thank you. Feng Ling hurriedly turned back to thank her, and then ran without stopping. She first ran back to Granny Mai's residence according to the familiar route, and then walked in the direction of the fork Granny Mai had mentioned. When she reached the right side, she began to look for the courtyard she had mentioned. After walking for nearly 100 meters, she finally saw a beautiful and clean courtyard with many flowers. Although the door to the courtyard was closed, there was still a gap. With a gentle push, it opened. When she looked up, the first thing she saw was the man's shirt and trousers. Although the clothes were covered with burn marks from the explosion, she could recognize that it was Li Nanheng's clothes. So he was here. She was not wrong. She had been at the Gorkin farm for 2 days. It turned out that he was only a few hundred meters away from her. He was still alive, breathing, and she could still hear news of him. Feng Ling forcefully suppressed the frequency of her hands and feet trembling with excitement. She calmly walked into the courtyard. When she walked in, she seemed to hear coughing coming from the house. The coughing sounded intermittent and very low. She couldn't tell if it was a simple cough or something, but that voice was indeed a very hoarse man's voice. Feng Ling abruptly walked to the door and saw that it was locked from the inside. She then looked around for the window, but after searching for a long time, she couldn't find any window that was open. The women in the Gorkin farm had a habit of protecting themselves, especially unmarried girls. They wouldn't casually reveal everything in the window. Feng Ling simply knocked on the door. After knocking for a long time, she finally heard footsteps from inside. The door opened, and the young girl she had seen by the river appeared. When she looked up to see Feng Ling, Carrie was shocked. Sorry to disturb you. I'm looking for Li Nanheng. Feng Ling looked straight into her eyes. If she wasn't Granny Mai's granddaughter, she might have pushed her away and barged in. Carrie seemed unfamiliar with Li Nanheng's name. She looked at her strangely. Are you the person my grandmother took in? Isn't the friend you're looking for at the doctor's place? The person in the doctor's room is indeed my friend, but the man in your room is my fiancé. His name is Li Nanheng. Feng Ling still looked into her eyes, and her words revealed a hint of sharpness that could not be ignored. Chapter 1363. The word fiancé caused Carrie's eyelids to twitch. Her expression turned cold. The person you're looking for isn't here. With that, she was about to close the door. Wait! Feng Ling raised her hand to press against the door that was about to be closed. She looked at the young girl. Granny Mai has been kind to me. She has taken me in for the past 2 days. You're her granddaughter, so I should be very polite to you. But you can't hide a seriously injured person in your own place. Have you ever thought that if he has a chance to survive but delays the treatment? This is no longer equivalent to saving people, but harming their lives. What are you talking about? What delay the treatment? Carrie's expression was unhappy. Anyway, I don't have the person you're talking about here. Take your hand away. Let me tell you, in our place you're an outsider. If it weren't for my grandmother, you would have been chased away long ago. If you dare to barge into my house, I'll go out and call everyone over right now. Let's see if the people here will still keep you. With that, Carrie forcefully pulled her hand down and slammed the door shut. At the same time, they could hear the sound of the door being locked from the inside again. Feng Ling looked at the tightly shut door in front of her, and her expression darkened. It was indeed because of Granny Mai that the people in this town trusted her. However, she was an outsider after all, so even if the people here would not chase her away, they would carefully avoid her when they saw an outsider. If she did anything impulsive here, Carrie, who had grown up here, would definitely be chased away to protect her. Kay was still here, and so was Li Nanheng. She couldn't be rash, especially since Carrie was Granny Mai's granddaughter. If it weren't for Granny Mai, she wouldn't have known about this. However, right now, she really wished she could kick open the door in front of her and rush in to see how badly Li Nanheng was injured. Feng Ling stood outside the door for a long time. She raised her hand and knocked a few more times. This time, Carrie couldn't even be bothered to respond. She did not make a sound. After about 10 minutes, Feng Ling heard a cough again. She shivered and hurriedly walked back and forth in the direction of the sound. Finally, she walked near the closed window. The sound was the clearest one she had heard recently. She pressed her hand against the window. The coughing just now was intermittent, but now she could not hear it anymore. His hand on the window was a little cold, contrary to the hot temperature in this place. It was very quiet inside. She didn't know if Li Nanheng was awake or unconscious. Granny Mai finally rushed over. Seeing Feng Ling standing outside the window, deep in thought, she immediately understood something and rushed over. How is it? You didn't see your friend? Feng Ling turned to look at her, and then raised her finger to point at the clothes on the drying rack. That's his clothes. I heard a cough inside. It must be him. Granny, I can't rashly enter your granddaughter's house. I can tell that she doesn't welcome me. She locked the door. But if she locked my friend inside just to prove her medical skills, it's not fair to us. Granny, please help me. Granny Mai's expression immediately changed. Nonsense. With that, she frowned and turned to the door. She raised her hand and knocked on the door. Carrie opened the door. It was quiet inside for a while. Carrie, Grandma is going to be angry. Granny Mai said unhappily. The person inside is Miss Feng's friend. She's seriously injured. Don't mess around. Finally, Carrie's voice came from inside. Grandma, that woman is lying. I asked him, and he said he doesn't know anyone surnamed Li, nor does he know the woman outside. Either she's mistaken, or she's lying. Grandma, it's so unsafe outside. How can you let a stranger stay here? Since she's already found that friend, she's still finding all sorts of reasons not to leave. I think she must have some other motive. Granny Mai was startled. Feng Ling shook her head when she turned to look at her. Granny Mai sighed and knocked on the door again. Open the door first and let her in to take a look. If it's really not her friend, she won't do anything to you. She'll leave immediately. No, his injuries haven't healed yet. He can't be exposed to the wind. Carrie's voice was very unhappy and impatient. Grandma, don't bring a stranger here. I saved him and even woke him up. This means that there's no problem with the medicine I used. Furthermore, he can't see right now. If that woman comes in and insists that she knows him, and he can't see who she is, it's not fair to him. I won't let her in. You child. And he clearly said that he doesn't know the woman outside. Why should he let her in? He's already injured. If she brings in any dirty things or bacteria, it won't be good for him. Carrie raised her voice. Grandma, quickly take her away. Don't let her come again. Feng Ling said. Miss Carrie, you know the situation of my friend at the doctor's place. They were all poisoned by the chemical smoke, and have all sorts of symptoms. His eyes and his inability to remember me might only be temporary. No matter what he has forgotten, it might just be a symptom. Let me take a look at him. I can tell with one look that he is. Stop lying. He didn't forget anything. When he woke up, he told me the reason why he was injured. Although he's very weak now, his words are clear, and he's always been sober. It's just that his eyes can't see. If he says he doesn't know you, then he doesn't know you. Carrie's tone was still unyielding. Feng Ling couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe it either. His words were clear. His memory was clear. How could he not remember her? It was impossible. She turned to look at the clothes hanging on the hanger outside. She walked over and took the clothes down. She looked at the material and size of the clothes, and then at the scorch marks on them. This was Li Nanheng's clothes. The only person who could be rushed to Gorkin Farm with Kay was Li Nanheng. There couldn't be anyone else. If she didn't lie, then the one who lied was someone else. Could Li Nanheng refuse to meet her when he knew she was here, and even say that he didn't know her? The only person who lied was this Carrie. But why did she lie? Chapter 1364. At the very least, Li Nanheng was alive. She was extremely sure of this. If he was still alive, then everything was fine. No matter if he was injured, disabled, or blind, he was still alive. Feng Ling suppressed the anger in her heart and said calmly, Granny, if she really doesn't want me to go in, I won't disturb her. But can you call the doctor here to take a good look? Don't delay the treatment. Carrie was suddenly unconvinced. She stood up and opened the door. After opening the door, her gaze flickered on Granny Mai's body for a moment before turning to look at Feng Ling. Are you looking down on my medical skills? A person who was almost dead when I saved him is now alive and well. Other than the fact that he can't see, there's nothing wrong with him. What right do you, an outsider, have to look down on my medical skills? Carrie, speak properly. Granny Mai reprimanded. Carrie rolled her eyes at Feng Ling and said impatiently, Grandma, I'm not lying. He really said that he didn't know her. You guys were so loud outside, and he was awake the whole time. She must have heard him coughing. If he knew her, he would have spoken long ago, but he said that he didn't know her. Impossible. Feng Ling looked up. If you don't believe me, ask him yourself. Anyway, I won't let you in. Didn't you hear him resting on the bed by the window? Ask him yourself through the window. Carrie rolled her eyes at her impatiently. You're standing right here. It's not like I can give him any bewitching soup. If he says he doesn't know her, he doesn't know her. There's no need for me to lie to you. Feng Ling's heart suddenly skipped a beat. She turned and walked back to the window. She raised her hand and pressed it against the window. She looked at the yellowing cloth that covered everything inside and slowly tightened her fingers on the window. Li Nanheng, is it you? There was no sound inside. I'm Feng Ling, her voice was slightly hoarse. I'm here to look for you. There was still no sound inside, but after a moment, there was a suppressed cough. It was the kind of cough that sounded uncomfortable, but it was the kind of cough that was restrained and suppressed without amplifying the sound. This meant that he was indeed awake. He could hear her voice by the window. Nanheng, Feng Ling pressed her hand hard against the window and raised her voice. No matter what happens, you can't not acknowledge me. Kay's leg is broken. I can take him back to Los Angeles. Even if you are blind or deaf, you are still Li Nanheng. No matter what happens, you can't push me away. This is what you promised. When you removed me from the base, you said that wasn't pushing me away. Then what is it now? You don't recognize me? It was very quiet inside. This time, there wasn't even a cough. Carrie lost her patience and said, Listen, he really doesn't care about you and doesn't know you. Can you give up now? Can we go now? I live alone in this small courtyard because I like to live a quiet life. Grandma, take this woman away and don't let her come back. With that, Carrie closed the door again. This time, she did not lock it, but looking at the tightly closed door, Granny Mai hesitated for a moment before looking at Feng Ling. Feng Ling remained standing in front of the window. She looked at it. I just want to know how badly you're injured. You don't want to see me, and you don't want to acknowledge me. Are you seriously injured? Can't you even let me take a look? Li Nanheng, I rushed here from New York. I didn't even bring a gun with me when I barged into Israel. Several planes crashed in front of me, but I didn't feel anything. I just wanted to find you and bring you back. Everyone thought you were dead. Even the rescue teams sent by the base several times have been evacuated. Tam and Lin Cheng specially escaped from the base to find you. In order to come to Israel, I even abandoned the phone corporation. But what are you doing? You're still alive, but you refuse to see me? The voice of the woman outside sounded very calm. There were no heart-wrenching curses or roars. She just stood outside the window and kept talking. After Carrie closed the door, she kept listening to the sound. She then turned her eyes and looked at the man who had been sitting silently by the window on the bed. He really did not speak. His unfocused eyes were wide open, and from time to time, he would raise his hand to his mouth to suppress his coughs because of coughing. At this moment, there was no movement outside. Carrie looked at the handsome but pale man. She turned around to pour a glass of water and walked to the bed. She whispered, You've always wanted to cough, haven't you? Drink a glass of water to suppress it. The man on the bed did not move. When he heard the footsteps outside the window gradually disappear, he slowly raised his hand, but raised it aimlessly in the air. Knowing that he could not see, Carrie quickly placed the glass of water in his hand. However, the man had been suppressing his cough for too long. At this moment, his hand suddenly touched the glass of water and accidentally knocked it over. Carrie let out a low cry. Just as she was about to speak, the man suddenly turned over and leaned over the bed, coughing out a large pool of blood on the ground. Ah, you! Carrie was so shocked that she couldn't care less about the cup and water stains on the blanket, and rushed to help him up. She watched as the man coughed up a few mouthfuls of blood and closed his eyes weakly, as though he had lost consciousness. She hurriedly got up to get the medicine. Ever since the day she saved him, he had been coughing up blood like this. He had been better since yesterday, and it had been more than 30 hours since he last coughed up blood. But he actually started coughing up blood again, and this time, it was so much. She knew that his internal organs had been damaged by the chemical explosion, and his internal organs were not light. Otherwise, he would not have coughed up blood like this. She quickly helped him back to the bed, and carefully wiped the blood from his mouth. Just as she was about to feed him the medicine, the man, who was leaning against the bed with his eyes closed, slowly raised his cold hand and gently pushed away her hand that was about to bring the spoon to his mouth. He said hoarsely, No need. Is your desire to live that bad? Carrie was so angry that her eyes turned red. It wasn't easy for me to save you. I used all kinds of miraculous medicines that our doctors here have developed for many years. It wasn't easy for you to wake up. How can I watch you waste your life like this? If I can't see, then I can't see. So what? It's useless. The man closed his eyes that could not see anything. His voice was so low that it was almost inaudible. I know my body. Don't waste the medicine. Chapter 1365. Carrie bit her lips hard and looked at him for a long time before saying, Will you obediently take the medicine and let me treat you properly if I call that woman named Feng Ling back? The man on the bed no longer spoke. She glared at him with red eyes. You actually know her, don't you? No matter if what she said about fiancé is true or not, you know her. You just don't want her to see you like this, right? The man frowned and closed his eyes. If you still refuse to take the medicine, I'll call her back now and let her watch you eat it. Don't. His pale brows furrowed even more. As expected, she scooped the medicine and brought the spoon to his mouth. Then drink the medicine now. You're injured in your internal organs. These medicines are useful to you. If I really can't cure you, you should have stopped breathing the day I brought you back. You have to believe me, and you have to believe in the medicine here. If you don't drink it, I'll call her back now. She left with my grandmother. She definitely hasn't gone far yet. Maybe if I shout now, she can hear me. Before Carrie could finish speaking, the man on the bed had already opened his pale and bloodless mouth. Seeing that he was willing to drink the medicine, Carrie was still angry. She didn't know why she was angry. She only knew that the relationship between this good-looking man and that woman was definitely not ordinary. He really didn't want her to see him like this. He was clearly seriously injured and hoped that someone would take care of him by his side. But he would rather not acknowledge her than be willing to be seen like this. His body was covered in wounds, and his eyes could not be seen. His face was fine, but there was a mark on his cheek. It was not very obvious, and after it healed, it would probably not be visible anymore. It was just that he was frighteningly pale and thin. Every day, she helped him change into the soft and comfortable white cotton clothes here. But every day, they would still be soaked in blood. That day, when she went to the riverside to clean the blood-stained clothes, the woman named Feng Ling looked at her with such a gaze. At that time, Carrie's heart inexplicably panicked. She was afraid that she would be discovered hiding a patient here. So she quickly walked away to avoid him. However, she still found him, but she didn't expect him to refuse to acknowledge her. With great difficulty, she managed to feed him half of the medicine, but he coughed up quite a lot of it. Carrie quickly went to scoop some more medicine and continued to feed him, but at this time, he could no longer drink it. He would spit out a mouthful after drinking a mouthful. It was obvious that his body was very uncomfortable and suffering. He laid quietly on the bed with his brows slightly furrowed. He waved his hand with a pleading attitude and said in a low voice, "Don't feed me. I can't drink it." Knowing that he really couldn't drink it, Carrie stood by the bed for a moment and had to think of other ways. Outside, Feng Ling supported Granny Mai back. Granny Mai glanced at her from time to time, but Feng Ling remained silent. "Child, don't be too sad. Maybe it was just a coincidence." Granny Mai comforted her. However, Feng Ling only curved her lips slightly. There was no extra emotion in her eyes. "I didn't make a mistake." Seeing that she was stubborn, Granny Mai couldn't persuade her anymore. In fact, Granny Mai also felt that it couldn't be such a coincidence. She also felt that someone must be lying. However, she understood her granddaughter. Although her personality was spoiled, she definitely didn't have any bad intentions. She wouldn't be so heartless to hide it when she could clearly see that Feng Ling was in a hurry. At first, when she said that there was no one at home, she was indeed lying, but later on, it didn't seem like she was lying. The person at her place should have really said that he didn't know Feng Ling. Feng Ling said that she didn't recognize the wrong person. But she didn't continue to pester Carrie. After helping Granny Mai back, she didn't say anything else. She didn't need the various things she had cut on the ground. She only glanced at them before leaving. Feng Ling returned to Kay's place. Kay had been waiting bitterly for her to return. Even though he was very weak, he had been waiting. Finally, when he saw Feng Ling return, he struggled to sit up. "How is it? Did you find Boss Lee? Is that him?" Feng Ling walked to the bed. "It's him." Kay's face was filled with joy. He was about to say that it was great that Boss was still alive. But when the words reached his mouth, he saw that Feng Ling's expression was very calm and didn't look very happy. He immediately couldn't smile and asked tentatively, "Then you?" "He refused to see me," Feng Ling said softly. She sat by the bed and looked at the scorching sun outside the window. "He didn't recognize me and didn't want to see me." Kay's expression softened. After a moment he said, "If it's really him, I can understand what Boss is thinking." Feng Ling was silent and did not speak. "He's such a proud person. For so many years, he's always been a winner. Even if he's injured, he never feels embarrassed. However, if he really can't see, no matter how proud he is, he won't be able to take it, especially when facing you. He can't face you at all, Kay said hoarsely. Fengling, since you know that boss is still alive, this is good news. Don't be anxious. Give him some time. His injuries are so serious. I can't wait forever, and I can't delay like this. Fengling was calmer than she had expected. I have to think of a way to bring you back. At least I have to leave Israel. Kay coughed and said, although I've never seen the medicine used by the doctors here, every country has something passed down. Their medical skills have at least saved our lives. I know, but right now you need to go back for more specific surgeries, as well as lung washing, blood clearing and disinfection. Chemical drugs are no joke. All the injuries may only be temporary, but if you don't go back and treat them soon, who knows if they will follow you for the rest of your lives. As Fengling spoke, she looked outside. That direction was the direction of Carrie's courtyard. Fengling's words were reasonable. Kay did not say anything else but looked at her. Why don't I go see boss? You can't move. Lie on the bed obediently. You're not allowed to go anywhere. Fengling clearly would not easily give up because of a woman's obstruction. Since I'm here, I can't leave any of you here. Li Nanhing refuses to see me. In the past, when I refused to see him, he used many shameless methods. Does he think I won't use them? K. Chapter 1366. That night, Fengling went to Carrie's house again. This time, she did not directly enter Carrie's courtyard. Instead, she stood outside for a while. Hearing the sound of the door opening, she turned slightly to the side and took a look inside. Carrie held another basin of blood-stained clothes in her hand, but this time, she did not seem to intend to go to the river outside to wash them. Instead, she opened a large water tank in the yard and got some water from it. She squatted in the yard to wash the blood stains on the clothes. Although the sky was already dark, and there were no streetlights in a barren place like the Gorkin farm, Fengling's eyesight had always been good. Especially at night, her eyesight was not affected by the sky at all. She could accurately tell that the blood on the clothes had just been stained. In other words, Li Nanhing's injuries had not healed, and were becoming more and more serious. Based on the frequency at which Carrie washed these bloody clothes, his injuries should be more serious than Kay. Apart from his broken leg and slightly slow reaction, Kay was fine. At the very least, he could communicate with her normally. As long as he recuperated for a few more days, when Tam and Lin Chung arrived, they could help bring him back. As for Li Nanheng, it seemed that the wounds on his body would often bleed. Fengling stood silently outside the yard and watched Carrie wash clothes. After watching for a long time, she gently pushed open the door and walked in. The door outside the yard suddenly opened with a creak. Carrie's hand paused in the water. She turned back to see that it was Fengling, who had come once during the day. Knowing that Fengling indeed had something to do with the person inside, Carrie couldn't be too wary of her right now. However, she still glanced at her unhappily. What time is it? Why are you here in the middle of the night? I've prescribed a lot of medicine from the doctor. Fengling was actually holding a bag of things in her hand. She placed the medicine on the stone table beside Carrie. Don't mind me. I didn't mean to underestimate your medical skills. I was just worried that you didn't have enough medicine here, so I asked the doctor for some. Carrie still didn't have a good expression on her face. She didn't even look at the medicine, and lowered her head to continue washing the clothes. As she scrubbed with her hands, she said coldly, "You make it sound nice. You're afraid that there's a problem with my medicine, right? You're also very smart. You should know that I'm not lying. I can guess why he doesn't want to see me, but please let me go in to see him. At least let me know how badly he's injured. If it's really serious, he must immediately return to where he belongs, and let him be treated as soon as possible. And if his eyes are really blind, he should go to a proper hospital for a proper examination and treatment as soon as possible." Fengling looked at her. "Miss Carrie, you're willing to save a life, which means that you're a very kind and warm-hearted person. I said I don't know you, but you still insist on sticking to me. He doesn't even want to see you. And you keep saying that you're his fiancé. Don't you feel ashamed? When Carrie hid something in her heart, she didn't know how to hide it. She didn't want to continue the topic of whether that person wanted to see her or not. She just raised her eyes and looked at her. I've already expressed it very clearly during the day. You know his attitude very well. He doesn't know you. Granny Mai is a very gentle person. I don't want anything unpleasant to happen between me and her granddaughter. I hope Miss Carrie won't be too stubborn. Fong Ling's voice turned cold, and her eyes were cold. Carrie sneered. You barged into my house in the middle of the night. If I don't let you in, can you still barge in? Fong Ling did not speak, but she had already answered with her actions. She turned and walked toward the tightly shut door. Hey, what are you doing? Seeing that she really had the intention to barge in, Carrie quickly stood up and chased after her. She stepped forward and opened her arms to block the closed door. She glared at the woman who had lost a lot of patience and clearly didn't want to be entangled with her anymore. She glared at her. This is my home. You can't barge in. What if I insist on going in? Fong Ling's eyes were not particularly cold, but her gaze was indeed like a thin layer of smoke behind the cold fog as she looked at her. She had indeed run out of patience. Li Nanheng's physical condition could not be delayed. Then I'll ask the people here to chase you out, Carrie said as she pulled a bell by the side of the door. Fong Ling glanced at the bell. If she guessed correctly, this should be a signal used by the locals of Gorkin Farm. If it rang, the people nearby would hear it. Now that it was late at night, they would hear it even more clearly. In other words, as long as the bell rang, many people would rush over immediately. Fong Ling glanced at the bell. Carrie stared at Fong Ling and suddenly said, You suddenly left in the afternoon. Is it because my grandmother is here? You don't want her to see your barbaric side. You're afraid that she'll know that you've taken in a robber, right? In the past, Fong Ling had never had a deep understanding of whether she was a man or a woman. But now at this moment, a woman's sixth sense was telling her. Carrie refused to let her in to see Li Nanheng. Apart from Li Nanheng's own reasons, Carrie also had her own selfishness. No matter what her selfishness was, Li Nanheng had to go back to America with her. A life is at stake, Miss Carrie. He's an injured person. He's a patient. His mind isn't clear. Is your mind also not clear? Fong Ling didn't want to cause a ruckus in Gorkin Farm at such a late hour, but she didn't give in. Do you want him to die here, or do you want him to go to a professional hospital to receive proper treatment and surgery? Carrie's expression turned bitter because of her words. What formal hospital? I've never seen it. I've been here since I was young. When I caught a cold, I used our medicine here. I'm still fine. Don't underestimate the people here. Don't deliberately misinterpret my words. You know very well what I'm talking about. Fong Ling looked at her coldly. If you delay any longer, you'll be no different from a murderer. Hearing the word murderer, Carrie's expression stiffened. She abruptly glared at her. What nonsense are you spouting? Before Carrie could finish her sentence, the door behind her suddenly opened. There were no lights in the courtyard, and only the bright moonlight in the sky illuminated the place. The moment she heard the door, Carrie paused and turned her head abruptly, almost at the same time as Fong Ling. She saw the man who had gotten out of bed and walked to the door. Chapter 1367. The man's eyes were unfocused, but this house was not big, and there were not many things inside. There were not many obstacles, and the bed was relatively close to here. He must have groped his way over. The moment the door opened, Fong Ling's footsteps were rooted to the ground. It was Li Nanheng. However, his face was as pale as paper. There was a trace of blood on one side of his cheek and on his forehead. The cotton clothes on his body seemed to have just been changed. They were clean without a trace of blood. He had lost a lot of weight, and there was a lot of stubble around his chin. Although his eyes were open, they were as calm as a lake of stagnant water. He did not move at all. Ah, why did you get out of bed? Carrie cried out softly, and quickly turned to help him up. However, the man behind the door only placed one hand on the door and opened his unfocused eyes. Then when Carrie approached, he raised his hand and suddenly held Carrie's hand. I heard some noise outside, so I came out to take a look. Li Nanheng's voice was so hoarse that it was almost inaudible, but the surroundings were very quiet. This short sentence was very clear. Carrie was also startled by his sudden hold of her hand. Then, her face strangely turned red, and her expression was somewhat awkward. Before she could speak, she heard Li Nanheng hold her hand and say, "Did that person come to disturb you again?" That person? Feng Ling's gaze was fixed on Li Nanheng's face. From the beginning, she was pleasantly surprised, and then shocked. Earlier, she had only been focused on his condition, but now, she abruptly noticed where his hand was placed. He was so intimate that he seemed to be very dependent on Carrie. Half of his body was almost leaning on Carrie. He held her with one hand and supported the door with the other. His movements were natural, as if Carrie was the woman he trusted the most and was the safest. Yes, she's here again. It seems like she was going to barge in and wake you up, right? Carrie said as she supported him. Let me help you back to bed first. How can you get out of bed now? Li Nanheng stood in front of the door and did not move. However, he opened his eyes that were like stagnant water and looked in the direction of the person standing outside the door. Go. Don't come back again. Feng Ling stared at his face and into his eyes. Li Nanheng. The man's expression was very calm, and his voice was still faint and unfamiliar, as if he really didn't know her. I don't know you. So you lost your memory? Feng Ling slowly clenched her fists and stared at him. Li Nanheng, you don't remember me, don't remember yourself, don't remember 11 base, and don't remember everything, right? The man stood motionless in front of the door and did not speak again. All right, don't say any more. His body can't take it. Carrie felt that the weight of the man's body could no longer support him and was gradually turning toward her. She quickly supported him and turned to look at Feng Ling. This time you've seen him. You've said what you need to say. If I say I don't know you, I don't know you. Is that enough? With that, Carrie supported him with one hand and quickly closed the door with the other. Feng Ling suddenly stepped forward and pressed her hand against the door, staring at the man who couldn't see her at all. Li Nanheng, I'm here to take you back to America. Must you do this? Are you done? A man doesn't even want to see you and doesn't know you, yet you're still so shamelessly pestering him. Isn't it too shameless? Carrie glared at her as she spoke. If you don't leave, I'm really going to call for help. Feng Ling stared expressionlessly at the man in front of her. She suddenly raised her hand and tugged the bell by the door down. Seeing that this woman had easily tugged the bell down, Carrie's expression was shocked. You. If it weren't for the fact that you saved him, you would have been knocked unconscious by me. Please shut up. Feng Ling turned her eyes and coldly glanced at Carrie again. She then retracted her gaze and pressed hard against the door. She stared at the silent, pale man. Li Nanheng, now that this shameless person has become me, are you happy? If you don't vent your hatred, come back with me now. After returning to America, you can do whatever you want. Don't waste your life here. However, the man's expression did not change. He only took a step back to avoid Feng Ling's aura. At the same time, he turned his pale face away and lowered his head to speak hoarsely in Carrie's ear. Close the door. When Carrie heard his words, she felt that his weight on her body was becoming heavier and heavier. She was afraid that she really couldn't hold on any longer. She quickly pulled out the latch from the door and raised it to Feng Ling. If you don't leave, I'm going to hit you. However, Feng Ling did not even look at her. Let me tell you, I've been here since I was young. Not only have I learned medicine, but I've also learned martial arts from many people. Don't force me to really hit you. It won't look good if two women fight. As soon as Carrie finished speaking, she suddenly felt that her hand was strangely empty. The door latch had somehow fallen into Feng Ling's hand. At the same time, the door latch suddenly fell to the ground. The sturdiest wooden door latch in their place was instantly split in half. Carrie's expression trembled violently. She abruptly raised her head to look at Feng Ling. However, Feng Ling only looked at Li Nanheng coldly from beginning to end, as though the smooth movements earlier did not come from her. You. Carrie was so angry that her face turned pale. You. However, at this moment Li Nanheng raised his hand. Even though he did not have much strength, He still placed his hand on the door. Then expressionlessly, he closed the door bit by bit. When the door hit Feng Ling, he turned his gaze away as though he did not see it. He closed the door heavily and pushed her out. He did not use much strength, but Feng Ling was forced to stagger back a step. Her eyes were fixed on Li Nanheng, who had personally closed the door. Carrie was dumbfounded. Until the moment the door finally closed, she was still staring at the door. However, in less than 3 to 5 seconds, the man who had been barely able to stand against her suddenly jerked violently. He abruptly coughed out a large mouthful of blood and instantly fell to the ground. She quickly reached out to support him, but she could only barely grab his arm. She watched as he knelt weakly on the ground, suppressing his coughing, but blood kept flowing out of his mouth. She quickly squatted down and said in a low voice as she supported him, "Oh my God! Quick, let me help you back to the bed. I said you can't move. Do you want to die?" Chapter 1368. Feng Ling stood outside the door and did not leave. Her hearing was very good. She heard the sounds of suppressed coughing and vomiting. Then she seemed to hear Carrie whisper, "Why is there so much blood again?" Feng Ling abruptly stepped forward and pushed the door twice, but it did not open. She endured it and did not do anything to Carrie for Granny Mai's sake. However, she could not care less now. She raised her foot and kicked the door hard. After 2 consecutive kicks, the door cracked, and the lock in the middle also cracked. Before Carrie could help Li Nanheng back to the bed, she heard a loud noise behind her. She turned her head abruptly and saw that the woman had kicked the door open and walked in quickly. "What are you doing?" Before she could finish speaking, the man who was being supported by Carrie was carried away by her. Li Nanheng coughed unsteadily, and the clothes he had just changed into and his chest were covered in blood. His chin was covered in blood, and he could barely open his eyes. He was pulled over by Feng Ling, and his tall but thin body slammed into her. He paused. He could not open his eyes, but he seemed to know something. He struggled weakly. Feng Ling held him back and turned to look at Carrie. "Go call the doctor. Do you really want him to die here?" Carrie was stunned. Looking at Feng Ling's gaze, she felt that she was too strong and could not resist. Although she was very confident in her medical skills, looking at Li Nanheng's current state, she pursed her lips, turned around and rushed out. Seeing that Carrie was finally willing to call the doctor, Feng Ling first looked at the environment in the room. It was very clean, but there were 2 large pools of blood on the ground from the door to here. Although the light in the room was not particularly bright, it was enough to see everything clearly. She helped Li Nanheng onto the bed and rushed to wipe the blood around his chin with a towel. The man slowly opened his eyes. He seemed to have difficulty breathing, and his eyes were still unfocused. He slowly raised his hand to push her hand away, but Feng Ling forcefully pressed him down. She pressed the towel firmly against his chin and said sternly, "Don't move." The man frowned imperceptibly, but he was so tired that he could not speak. He was also so uncomfortable that he could only keep swallowing the smell of blood that he wanted to vomit. He endured it, but it was not difficult to tell that he was really uncomfortable. "Li Nanheng, if you dare to die, I'll immediately take out a gun and shoot myself in the head. Since I was young, everything important in my life has been entangled with you. If you dare to abandon me, even if you go to hell, you can't shake me off." Feng Ling spoke as she pressed his shoulder hard and quickly wiped away the blood. She felt that although the man's hand only struggled for a moment, he did not move again. She didn't know if it was because he really did not have the strength, or because of her words. But at the very least, he could not beat her now. It was difficult for him to even stand up. The arrogance he usually showed in front of her was gone. What could he use to fight with her? She wiped away the blood on his body and looked at the cotton clothes on his chest that were dyed red with blood. Feng Ling's heart had become especially calm after the torture of the past few days. Even if the man she had been searching for a long time was likely to die in front of her in the next second, she had to remain calm. Because why are you coughing blood? Are your internal organs injured? Where were you when the explosion occurred? Were you affected at the edge, or were you shaken into the water at the center of the earthquake? Feng Ling asked as she tugged at his clothes. Li Nanheng was indeed powerless to resist. Even though he knew what she was doing, he could only raise his hand weakly, and then place it weakly on his lap. As soon as the blood-stained clothes on his upper body were pulled open a little, she saw that the man's skin, which should have been smooth, clean, and strong, was covered with wounds of all sizes. There were not many burns, but many of them seemed to be caused by falling and scratching when he fell. There was a large bruise on his chest. She didn't know if it was because of external injuries, internal injuries, or chemical poisoning. She was not a doctor, but she knew that if he continued to delay like this, he would really lose his life. Looking at the wounds, Feng Ling gritted her teeth hard and pulled open his sleeves. She saw the various scars on his arms and many swollen ones that seemed to have been washed by water a few days ago. It was simply unimaginable how he managed to survive this calamity. She could not imagine what kind of psychological blow and torment he would suffer when he opened his eyes and could not see anything. Earlier, she was still angry and hateful, but now, she could not hate him. If it were her, she might also choose to die quietly by herself. She didn't want anyone to see her like this, which would make people sad and distressed. She held onto his arm tightly and gripped his sleeves. She forced the tears in her eyes back and put down his sleeves. Then, she tidied up his blood-stained clothes. Seeing that he couldn't even sit properly on the bed, she hurriedly helped him lie down. When she lay down, the man frowned. She paused and slowed down her movements slightly. At the same time she whispered, "Did I hurt you?" The man closed his eyes and did not say anything, nor did he nod or shake his head. She continued to patiently help him lie down. After covering him with the blanket, she squatted down by the bed and looked closely at the thin, pale man lying on the bed with his eyes closed. The last time she saw him was at Mr. Mike's resort. He was still coaxing her to drink. He was still the same Li Nanheng from before, so determined to get her. However, the current Li Nanheng had lost so much weight in just a few days. He was so haggard and pale that she could hardly recognize him, especially in his attitude toward her. He used to be the man who could protect her domineeringly and patiently no matter how angry she was, and how she ignored him. And at this moment, she had never seen him so haggard and weak. It was so rare for him to need her protection. This was different from the injuries he had suffered during a mission. He had even started to avoid her. Li Nanheng listened. Feng Ling squatted by the bed and looked at his face. She raised her hand and gently stroked the stubble around his chin. "As a man, you have to keep your word. If I lose, you have to go back and marry me." Seeing that he did not speak and did not turn his head, Feng Ling could not tell if she was comforting or mocking him. She said indifferently, "I didn't expect that a man like you, whose heart is thicker than a mountain and bigger than the sea, would feel inferior. So what if you can't see? Isn't your face not ruined? Can't you still rely on your face to eat? Why are you hiding?" Chapter 1369. As Feng Ling spoke, she reached for his hand that hung weakly by his side. As soon as she held his hand, the man coughed violently again. She didn't know if it was because he instinctively wanted to cover his mouth, or because he wanted to pull his hand out. In any case, he was trying to break free from her hand. Feng Ling didn't force him. After the man pulled his hand out, the suppressed cough made the pain in her heart that she had been deliberately suppressing emerge bit by bit. He suddenly couldn't help but cough violently again on the bed, and blood that he couldn't suppress flowed out of his mouth. Feng Ling quickly stood up and was about to help him sit up. It was too uncomfortable for him to choke back the blood. However, as soon as her hand touched his shoulder, the man seemed to have been electrocuted and suddenly shook her off. At the same time, he swung her hand away. Perhaps due to overexertion, the blood all over his body and chin made him look like a lonely soul who had just crawled out of a pool of blood. He looked extremely terrifying and pathetic. Then, he pushed away her hand that was about to reach out to support him again. However, because of his unstable body, he sat on the bed with one hand and staggered for support. He spat out another mouthful of blood and said in a low and hoarse voice, "Why are you still here? What are you doing?" Feng Ling frowned. "You still want to chase me away at a time like this? Li Nanheng, are you? Go!" The man's face was filled with pain, and there seemed to be some impatience in the pain. He refused her touch, and only pushed her hand away again and again. He staggered and lay on the edge of the bed. There were still traces of blood and foam in his mouth, and when he spoke, blood flowed out of his mouth. Go! Feng Ling was pushed away by him again and again, but she couldn't get angry at all. Seeing him like this, the pain in her heart spread bit by bit to her limbs. She quickly bent down to help him up. Boss! This call of boss caused the man, who was trembling in pain and so weak that he could barely open his eyes, to frown imperceptibly. Feng Ling gripped his shoulder tightly and helped him sit up. Don't push me. You can't leave someone by your side right now. Li Nanheng didn't look at her. Seeing that in just a few days, he had become so thin and pale that even the blood vessels under his eyelids could be seen clearly, and his body was so cold that all the warmth was about to fade. She quickly pulled the quilt on the bed over him and held him firmly in her arms like how he used to protect her in the past, not giving him the slightest chance to break free. She pressed her face against his, and her voice was close to his bloody mouth as she said, "Don't chase me away. Let me accompany you. Don't chase me away again." Li Nanheng clearly wanted to chase her away, but he didn't have the strength to do so. He only frowned and slowly turned his face away, not allowing her to use her fair and clean skin to rub against the blood on his mouth. 3 or 4 minutes later, the sound of hurried footsteps came from outside. It wasn't just one person's footsteps. Carrie had already called the doctor over. She rushed in and saw the man wrapped in the blanket tightly in Feng Ling's arms. There was blood by the side of his mouth and on the bed. Carrie immediately cried out softly, "Is he coughing up blood again? He clearly looked much better after waking up a few days ago. Why is he vomiting blood so badly these 2 days? Uncle Mona, quickly look at him. I clearly used the right medicine." The doctor, who was addressed as Uncle Mona, had gotten to know Feng Ling in the past few days. Seeing that the man's condition was indeed not good, he did not care about being polite and walked over. However, just as the doctor was checking Li Nanheng's injuries and was about to remove his clothes, Li Nanheng seemed to be half awake again. He suddenly raised his hand to block the doctor's hand. "Are you still conscious?" As Dr. Mona had known Granny Mai for many years, he knew some simple Chinese that sounded a little awkward. Carrie said that your injuries are very serious, even more serious than those of the young man at my place. I need to check all the injuries on your body. Li Nanheng did not move. His hand continued to block Dr. Mona's hand. His expression was determined. He did not want to be undressed again. Carrie was extremely anxious from behind. "Uncle Mona is the doctor who taught me medicine. He's the best doctor in our Gorkin farm. Let him take a look." After a moment of silence, Li Nanheng said hoarsely, "Let her out." Because Feng Ling was hugging him tightly, she was the closest to him. Even if he didn't say her name, she immediately understood what he meant. He meant to let her out. Her expression darkened. At this moment, Dr. Mona also raised his eyes to look at her. "Miss Feng Ling, let me check his injuries first. It seems like he won't cooperate if you're here." Feng Ling's hand gripped the blanket by Li Nanheng's side tightly. At this moment, Carrie walked over and looked at her. She wanted to say something, but she was frightened by Feng Ling's cold aura. She only glanced at her from time to time, indicating for her to quickly cooperate and leave. Feng Ling had no choice but to move her hand away from Li Nanheng's body. After letting him go, she stood up from the bed and took a step back. She did not want to affect the doctor's examination of his injuries. She could stand further away. The doctor did not say anything else. He was about to unbutton Li Nanheng's clothes when the man on the bed raised his hand to stop him. He coughed again and coughed up blood again. The moment he coughed up blood, he said hoarsely with difficulty, "Let her out." Feng Ling's expression did not show any emotions. She only looked at the man on the bed who repeatedly wanted to let her out. Dr. Mona could actually forcefully hold the patient down because he was out of strength. But even though this man was so injured and weak, he inexplicably felt a sense of oppression that he did not dare to forcefully hold him down. He could only turn back to look at Feng Ling quickly go out. "He doesn't want to see you at all. I saw that he coughed up blood especially badly these 2 times. It's all because of your appearance. He was originally fine. If you weren't here, he wouldn't have been so agitated and wouldn't have been like this. Hurry up and get out. Carrie also muttered unhappily. I've been chasing you away, but you're still here. Now that the doctor is here, you're still in the way. Feng Ling slowly clenched her fists and then loosened them. All right. With that, she turned her gaze away and walked out of Carrie's room. Chapter 1370. The door was closed from the inside again. Through the door, she could no longer hear anything inside. Everything was quiet. Feng Ling stood outside the door and turned back to look at it. She stood outside for a long time until Granny Mai rushed over after hearing the news. Seeing Feng Ling standing outside the door, she immediately approached. Since the doctor is here, don't worry. I heard about Carrie going to look for the doctor. You have already seen your friend, right? Feng Ling did not speak. She stood there and looked at the tightly shut door without saying a word. Seeing her expression, Granny Mai could not bear to see her like this. She raised her hand and gently patted her back. Child, since he's still alive, there's always hope. Be patient. Feng Ling pursed her lips slightly, but her smile was not obvious. It was clearly a polite response to Granny Mai, and she continued to remain silent. From night to dawn, from dawn to noon, Granny Mai came and left. In the morning, she prepared some food and brought it over. Seeing that Feng Ling was still standing in the yard, The door had not been open for the past few hours. Carrie and the doctor had been inside. She didn't know how they were doing, so it wasn't appropriate for her to ask. She could only persuade Feng Ling to eat something. Feng Ling thanked the granny, but she was really not hungry and could not eat. It was almost afternoon when Granny Mai came again. Seeing that she was still standing outside, she said, It's going to rain soon. Our place is close to the desert. It's rare for it to rain once a year. From the weather, the rain shouldn't be light. Come back with me first. Come back when the doctor gives you the news. There's no need, Granny. Even though Feng Ling had been standing outside for a long time, her legs were not so numb that she could not move. When she was punished in the base, it was common for her to stand for an entire day with a heavy bag. She said to Granny Mai, But I still have to trouble you with one thing. Speak. When the door opens, your granddaughter might not agree to let me in. Feng Ling's words stopped there, but Granny Mai quickly understood what she meant. She nodded. I'll talk to her properly. Although she's a little impatient, she doesn't have any bad intentions. She'll definitely listen to me. Thank you, Granny. The Gorkin farm was located at the edge of the desert, and all the water they usually ate and used depended on the river. It really didn't rain here all year round. If it rained twice a year, it would be a blessing from the heavens. This rain was indeed very heavy. According to Granny Mai, this was the heaviest rain she had seen in the decades since she came to Gorkin farm. Lightning flashed and thunder roared, pouring down in torrents. The sound of rain could be heard. Usually, when the people here saw rain, they would be happy as if they were celebrating a festival. However, although the sound of rain was clear outside, Carrie's small house was filled with the smell of medicine. The man on the bed had already been changed by the doctor inside and out, and the wounds on his body had also been reapplied with medicine. After being fed medicine, he had slept twice, and after waking up, he would fall asleep again in less than an hour. He was really exhausted, and the burden and exhaustion on his body and mind were too heavy. Dr. Mona stood by the medicinal stone table in the small house, patiently mixing medicine as he spoke in the local language. It's raining outside? Carrie made an N sound. It sounds like it's raining. Dr. Mona pondered for a moment and looked in the direction of the tightly shut door. See if Miss Feng hasn't left yet. She was still outside this morning. Carrie had no choice but to turn to the door. She gently opened the door and looked out. She saw that Feng Ling was still standing in the courtyard. She had not moved a single step since last night. The rain was pouring, but she was still standing there, standing straight in the rain. Although this small town was barren, the ratio of men to women was still considered normal. There were quite a few women, but Carrie had never seen such a righteous woman, who did not seem to be delicate at all. She was clearly a young girl. At first, when she stood outside, Carrie thought that she was just trying to hurt herself. She thought that she wanted to use this method to force the person inside to feel sorry for her, so that he could let her in. However, when the person inside found out that she had been standing outside, he did not say anything. He did not wake up much the entire day, and his body could not bear the burden. He was half asleep the entire time. Even if he knew that Feng Ling was outside, he did not have the strength to say anything. And this Feng Ling, from last night until now, had not eaten, drank, or left. She did not cry or shout outside. She quietly did not come in to disturb them, but insisted on standing outside, and did not take a step away. Even though it was raining heavily, she still stood there like a tree. She had never seen such a woman, but for some reason Carrie could not hate her. After watching for a while, she gently closed the slightly open door, and turned back to whisper to the doctor. She's still standing there, being drenched by the rain. At this moment, the eyelids of the man sleeping on the bed moved slightly, but he didn't move at all. It seemed that he wanted to open his eyes, but he didn't have the strength. After a long time, he finally opened his eyes, but he still couldn't see anything. He could only hear the sound of rain, lightning, and thunder outside the window. It was as if the sky was leaking, and it was pouring down. Feng Ling stood outside. Although it was raining heavily, she did not feel cold. This place was always hot in the 30s all year round. It was rare for it to rain. Although it was cool, it was not cold. After being in the rain for so long, Feng Ling's mind was probably drenched by the rain. She was abnormally awake. She seemed to recall such a scene. When she returned to the Feng family, she was in the room for 2 days because of gastric bleeding and a high fever. Later, the servant said that Li Nanheng was outside. At that time, she did not want to see him, so he guarded her outside for a long time. He did not force her to come in to see her. He just stood there and guarded her. When she got out of bed and walked to the window, she saw him standing outside. Time went back and forth. She didn't expect that there would be such a day. Everything was reversed. He was inside and she was outside. The man who had once wanted to embrace her into his world was now refusing to acknowledge her and see her. Now, she finally knew what Li Nanheng was thinking when he stood outside. He only wanted to accompany her. He did not need to obtain anything. He just wanted to accompany her. The rain dripped down her eyelashes and climbed onto her face. Feng Ling quietly placed her hand on her leg and looked at the house in front of her. Even when the sky turned dark again, the rain still did not stop. She walked in front of Feng Ling and said unhappily, "Go in. The rain is too heavy. Even if you don't feel cold, it's not good for your body to be soaked in the rain. Uncle Mona has too many patients recently. He doesn't want another one like you." Feng Ling didn't know what to say. She didn't say anything. Chapter 1371. However, Feng Ling did not move. She only glanced at Carrie and said lightly, "It's fine. It's fine as long as I can hear the sounds inside. If there's anything you need me to do, I'll go in immediately. I won't be here now." "What? It's not like Uncle Mona, and I chased you out. Why are you throwing a tantrum?" Carrie glared at her unhappily. Feng Ling finally looked at Carrie's face. "Didn't you say that he would only be emotionally unstable when he saw me?" Carrie rolled her eyes. "He hasn't woken up yet. His body is too weak, and he's coughed up so much blood. It's probably still a long time before he's completely awake. Go in and hide from the rain. It won't be too late to come out when the rain stops, and your clothes are dry." Feng Ling glanced at her again. Carrie's umbrella was already above her head. She said impatiently, "If you don't go in, I won't care." As soon as she finished speaking, Feng Ling had already moved forward. Carrie watched in surprise as she walked in. After entering the door, she quickly closed the umbrella and muttered in surprise, "You've been standing outside for so long and haven't moved at all. Don't you sway at all when you walk? Don't your legs hurt or ache?" "They're fine." Feng Ling did not explain. After entering the door, she immediately looked at the man, who was still unconscious on the bed. She originally wanted to go over to take a look, but she realized that her clothes were wet. After being drenched in the rain, it was probably not good for him to go over with the cold air. So she decided not to go over. She walked to Dr. Mona and gave him a grateful look. Dr. Mona didn't say much, and just smiled politely. After all, he had personally seen how Feng Ling treated Kay 2 days ago. He knew that she must have an inseparable relationship with these two injured people who had been washed into their town. Furthermore, this Miss Feng's character was not bad. The person she cared about was seriously injured and unconscious here. There was no need to torture her like this. Not long after, Carrie went to the inner room at the back of the small house and found a light yellow cotton dress. She handed it to Feng Ling without a good expression. "Well, your clothes are so wet and dripping. Don't wet the floor in my room. Go change your clothes." As she spoke, Carrie looked her up and down for a while. "This dress of mine was bought by a merchant in town who went to Jerusalem. I bought it because it looked good. But it was a size too big for me. So I only tried it on once and hung it in the cabinet without touching it again. You're taller than me, so these clothes should fit you. Go and change." Feng Ling knew that this Carrie was a little spoiled and unreasonable. But it was indeed as Granny Mai had said. She was just spoiled, but she didn't have any bad intentions. At this moment, looking at the clothes that were handed to her, and then at the somewhat arrogant expression on Carrie's face, the cold ice in Feng Ling's eyes gradually melted. "Thank you." Carrie did not respond. It was obvious that she had taken out her clothes for her to wear. It was only right for her to thank her. She turned her head and continued to accompany the doctor to dispense the medicine. Then, she pointed with her chin in the direction of the inner room, where she had gone to get her clothes. "Go over there to change. I sleep in there. By the way, don't touch my things. Come out after you're done changing." Feng Ling went in to change. She saw a clean towel by the bed, and guessed that Carrie had placed it here. Granny Mai's granddaughter was actually quite a meticulous person. From the layout of the inner room, she was a girl who loved cleanliness. There were beds, cabinets, and all kinds of daily necessities. They were all in the style of Israelis. There were many flowers planted in the yard outside, and there were many vases by the bed. Furthermore, since there was a bed here for her to sleep on, the bed outside was probably a temporary one. In the days that Li Nanheng was here, the two of them slept in 2 different rooms without disturbing each other. Feng Ling lowered her head, undid the belt of her clothes, and took them off layer by layer. The clothes worn by women in this place were very complicated. In her eyes, it was really troublesome to put on such a cotton dress. It was not as convenient as a t-shirt, but she did not bring any clothes. Although it was not convenient to wear this cotton dress, it was good that it was very fitting. After changing her clothes, she picked up a towel and dried her hair. Then, she casually tied her hair into a bun and tied it behind her head with a rubber band. When he walked out again, the rain outside seemed to have lessened a little. Dr. Mona patted the dregs on his hand and said, "Carrie, take the umbrella and follow me back. Go and get some supplementary medicine. It's still raining, so the medicine can't get wet. You have to help me hold the umbrella." "All right." Carrie stood up and was about to follow him when she suddenly turned back to look at Feng Ling, who had just walked out of the inner room. A few days ago, Feng Ling had been wearing some clean old clothes that Granny Mai had found. They looked very good on Feng Ling, but this light yellow dress had an especially clear girlish feel. When Feng Ling wore it, it was so beautiful that Carrie was jealous. Why didn't it fit her? If she were a few centimeters taller, she might be very beautiful in such a beautiful dress. Carrie was a little angry. Her woman's instincts made her regret letting her wear such a beautiful dress. But now she had to go back with Dr. Mona to retrieve the medicine. Thus, she said to Feng Ling with an unhappy expression, "I'll go get the medicine with Uncle Mona. He hasn't woken up yet. Stay here and guard him. We'll be back later." Feng Ling answered, "All right." This was Carrie's home. In fact, she didn't want Feng Ling to stay here alone to guard him. However, as a doctor, it was more important for her to get the medicine. She could only turn around unwillingly and leave with the doctor. The door opened and closed, and the small room was silent. Feng Ling turned to look at Li Nanheng on the bed and walked over. There was a small wooden stool by the bed. Dr. Mona had probably sat on it to facilitate his diagnosis. She sat down on the small wooden stool and looked at the man who had his eyes closed and was motionless on the bed. Li Nanheng was originally a tall and straight man. Although he wasn't the kind of man with tangled muscles, he was definitely a man with perfect muscles and a strong sense of strength. However, Li Nanheng was lying here and had lost a lot of weight. Although the muscles on his body wouldn't disappear in just a few days, it looked like he had really lost a lot of weight. She looked at his hand that was resting on the side of the blanket. He was so quiet that he didn't even move his fingers. She gently reached out and touched his hand. She was so careful that she didn't wake him up, afraid that he would chase her away, or afraid that she would hurt him. Then slowly, she held his hand in her own and intertwined her fingers. There's no more torture later. Little Feng Ling is so domineering. There's no way she'll let Li Era succeed. Even if she has to kidnap him, she'll kidnap him back to Los Angeles. He's so weak now. He can't beat her, right? Chapter 1372. Perhaps because she hadn't slept well for the past 2 days, she held his hand and sat by the bed to look at him. She felt that his slightly cold palm was still warm, and she could feel the pulse on his wrist. Outside, there was the sound of rain, and the room was filled with the fragrance of medicine. Feng Ling sat on the small wooden stool and pressed her forehead against his hand to sleep. After sleeping for less than 10 minutes, there was a sudden clap of thunder in the sky. Feng Ling opened her eyes with a jerk, only to see that Li Nanheng was still sleeping. The temperature of his hand had always been warm, and the intermittent beating of his pulse was maintaining his extremely fragile life. Feng Ling opened her eyes to look at him. She held his hand tightly and moved the small stool forward, leaning even closer against the bed. She held his hand while looking at the man's weak and sleeping face. From Washington to New York, to Jerusalem, to this Gorkin farm, she had searched for him for so many days. Now he was still alive. Even if he was seriously injured and unconscious, he at least had a peaceful breathing and vitality. She could feel his temperature and see his existence on her fingertips. As if she had thought of something, Feng Ling slowly raised his hand and pressed his warm palm against her face. She gently rubbed his hand against her face and kept looking at him. At this moment, the sound of hurried footsteps came from outside. Carrie and the doctor hurriedly brought the medicine back. At this moment, the sound of hurried footsteps came from outside. Carrie and the doctor hurriedly brought the medicine back. After entering the door, Carrie shook off the water on the umbrella and turned to see Feng Ling standing by the bed. She then looked at her holding Li Nanheng's hand and wanted to say something. She endured it and did not speak. In the blink of an eye, she saw that the doctor gave her a look and asked her to continue helping. Carrie had no choice but to follow. When he went to the side to continue preparing the medicine, Dr. Mona said softly in the local language, "In order to find him, Miss Feng seems to have rushed here from far away." Carrie lowered her head to prepare the medicine. She did not reply, but her expression was clearly unhappy. "He doesn't belong to you," Dr. Mona said again. Carrie pursed her lips. After a long while she said, "I know. It's good that you know. There are many men in our town who like you. There's no need for you to care too much about an unknown outsider. Besides, it's obvious that they're a very affectionate couple." Carrie was depressed for a long time before she said, "Uncle Mona, I've never thought that an Asian man was so good-looking before. When I brought him back from the river that day, I only wanted to save him. After wiping him clean, I realized that this man is really good-looking. Even if it's pretty, it's not yours." "I know." Carrie pursed her lips. When this Miss Feng came to look for someone that day and said that she was looking for her fiancé, I knew. Looking at her indignant little eyes, Dr. Mona smiled. He knew that she knew her limits and just didn't know how to restrain her emotions, so he didn't say anything else. He only reminded her one last time, "You're a doctor." "Yes." Feng Ling couldn't understand their conversation, but she had no time to listen because Li Nanheng had woken up. His fingers moved first. He probably felt that someone was holding his hand. He instinctively wanted to move his hand away, but she held it tightly. He opened his eyes. Even though he couldn't see, he didn't move much. However, he seemed to know who was holding his hand by the bed. Seeing that he had woken up, Feng Ling quickly got up. As though afraid that her existence would agitate him again, she did not dare to speak. She only turned to look at the doctor for help. Seeing this, Dr. Mona walked over. Only then did Feng Ling let go of his hand. When she let go, the man did not habitually grab her like before. Instead, he quietly placed his hand by the bed and did not make any unnecessary movements. The doctor went to check on his current condition. Feng Ling kept her gaze on the bed, unwilling to leave it for even an inch. 10 minutes later, the doctor retreated from the bedside. She saw that Li Nanheng had already closed his eyes again, but his eyes seemed to be slightly red. It was probably because his eyes were uncomfortable, and not because he had fallen asleep again. Dr. Mona turned back to continue preparing the medicine. At the same time, he said a few words to Carrie. After listening for a while, Carrie turned back to translate for Feng Ling. Uncle Mona said that he applied medicine to his eyes during the day. Later, his eyes were probably uncomfortable from the stimulation of the medicine, so he took it off again. He just woke up. When he opened his eyes, there were still some remnants of medicine around his eyes. That's why his eyes are red. Don't worry. Feng Ling did not say anything, but nodded gratefully at Carrie. Carrie looked at her unwillingly, but there was nothing she could do. No matter how natural enemies women were, at this time, she could only be considered a doctor. She had only saved a man. She couldn't really snatch a man from someone else. If that happened, her grandmother would probably beat her to death with her walking stick. After a while, the doctor handed Feng Ling a bowl of black and green medicine that he had just prepared. He wanted her to feed Li Nanheng the medicine. When Feng Ling took it, Carrie glared at the doctor unhappily. The doctor pretended not to see and gestured for Feng Ling to take good care of him. Feng Ling nodded and walked to the bedside with the bowl of medicine. Dr. Mona then gave Carrie a warning look like an elder. Carrie pouted, angrily picked up the umbrella, and turned to leave. By the bedside, Feng Ling heard the door open and close. She looked at Carrie's back, and then turned to look at Dr. Mona. The doctor gave her a "it's fine, don't worry about her" look before Feng Ling retracted her gaze. She first tried to help Li Nanheng up from the bed. The man on the bed seemed to have sensed it when her hand touched him. When he was about to avoid her, Feng Ling pressed him down gently and slowly. She firmly and unyieldingly helped the man, who was so weak that he could not even defeat a single finger of hers. She then picked up the pillow and another blanket by the side and helped him make a comfortable place to lean against. She then gently pressed him down so that he could lean against it. Li Nanheng was clearly resistant to her. Although Feng Ling had never spoken, they were too familiar with each other. A habitual movement of her hand, a breath, even if it was silent, even if he couldn't see, he could accurately sense that she was by the bed. Feng Ling gently blew on the medicine, sat by the bed, and carefully fed it to his mouth. Seeing that he did not open his mouth, she placed the black and green medicine back to her mouth to taste it. The taste was still strange and disgusting, similar to the medicine Kay used. She felt that the temperature was fine and continued to bring it to his mouth. Chapter 1373. Li Nanheng did not drink it at first, but Feng Ling used a spoon to gently pry open his motionless lips and fed him the medicine bit by bit. The man frowned, as though he felt that her hands would be sore if she kept raising them like this. After holding on for a long time, he opened his unfocused eyes and calmly ate the medicine. Seeing that he was actually cooperating, Feng Ling's heart finally relaxed a little. Her lips were dyed with a smile for the first time in days, and she continued to feed him. She fed him diligently. He could not see her and did not say anything. After drinking more than half of the medicine, Feng Ling turned back to ask the doctor if he wanted to continue feeding him. The doctor looked at the remaining medicine and told her with his eyes that it was enough. This kind of eye contact was the way they were used to communicating when they were taking care of Kay at the doctor's house a few days ago. Although Dr. Mona knew a little simple Chinese, his vocabulary was very small. Other than the occasional necessary conversation, he could not communicate for a long time. Feng Ling put down the bowl and picked up a clean towel to gently wipe the medicine stains by his mouth. The man did not resist. Although he could not see, His eyes did not stay in her direction. He was clearly tilting his head and not looking at her. Feng Ling was here tonight. Especially after Li Nanheng woke up, she did not say a word. Even though they knew each other well, she did not speak. She only sat by the bed and watched him take care of him. Even if there was an obvious indifference in his eyes that kept people 1,000 miles away. Late at night, Carrie had yet to return. Granny Mai came over and brought them some food. She then told Feng Ling that Carrie had gone to her place to spend the night, and that there was no need to worry. Not long after, Dr. Mona also went out for an emergency because a child from a family in the town was sick. He asked Feng Ling to stay here alone and prepared the medicine to be heated by the side. Late at night, although this was Carrie's room, the room was quiet and only the two of them were left. Feng Ling silently sat by the bed and watched the man who had already laid down again. Li Nanheng closed his eyes, and the redness around his eyes had mostly recovered. She tentatively reached out to touch his eyelids to see if there were any signs of his eyelids heating up. However, when her hand was still a centimeter away from his eyes, the man abruptly raised his hand to hold her wrist. Although Li Nanheng was not strong, his intention to stop him was obvious. Right now, his eyes were the most sensitive part of his body and heart. Feng Ling withdrew her fingers and looked down at him. After a long while, she finally withdrew her hand and said softly, "Li Nanheng." The man closed his eyes and did not respond. He only quietly placed his hands back to his side. When he heard her voice, he did not have any extra reaction. It was as though a completely unrelated person was disturbing his sleep. He merely adopted an attitude of ignoring her. Seeing that he was not agitated, Feng Ling confirmed that the 2 times he coughed up blood were coincidences. She leaned closer to the bed and whispered, "Bossly." Hearing these words, the man on the bed still did not have any reaction. "Kay lost a leg," she said softly. "Do you know?" Finally, this news that he had only learned after being unconscious for many days caused the man's brows to furrow silently. Although it was not obvious, even the slightest fluctuation in his emotions could still be captured by Feng Ling, who was sitting by the bed. She continued, "He knows that you risked your life to save him, so even though he lost a leg, he at least saved his life." The room was quiet. There was only the disgusting and bitter smell of medicine that was acceptable. Feng Ling's voice also appeared very quiet in this quiet room. Her clear and clean voice clearly broke through the dark fog of the night and penetrated the high walls layer by layer. If at this time, Kay gives up the chance to be treated because he has no leg and some symptoms caused by chemical poisoning, would you hate iron for not being strong enough? Would you want to wake him up? Feng Ling looked at his face as she spoke. "Just like how I treat you now. If you weren't so weak that you couldn't even stand up, Li Nanheng, I would slap you a few times first." Speaking up to here, Feng Ling suddenly smiled self-deprecatingly and looked at the man who had closed his eyes without any reaction. "Are you scolding me in your heart? I've never been very gentle to you, have I? I still remember what you said to me. Now I can ask you the same question." She leaned against the bed, leaned close to his ear, and whispered, "Li Nanheng, you've been a tyrant in my life for more than 10 years, stirring up waves after waves in my life. Now you say you don't remember me. And you say you don't remember me? Do I agree?" He did not speak, and Feng Ling was not anxious. Anyway, she knew that he was awake. "Speaking of which, the last time we met was in Washington. You should know how I was drunk step by step the night before." Feng Ling's voice was clear. "Why? Are you so eager to get rid of your relationship with me? Are you afraid that I'll settle the score with you? You deliberately got me drunk to trick me, didn't you?" As Feng Ling spoke, she continued to whisper into his ear. Her breath gently brushed against his ear. "You should know very well that I was already awake at that time. I remember everything that happened after I returned to the room from the hot spring. Do you want me to repeat what happened to you?" Finally, on the bed, the man who had always been calm and unperturbed slightly turned his pale face, obviously avoiding her breath. Feng Ling, who had always been passive and was always very contradictory and unreasonable when it came to matters between men and women, took the initiative to mention that night. Her voice was slow and gentle. and there was a different kind of ruthlessness in her seductive voice. He didn't acknowledge her, so she was angry. But she couldn't be angry. Feng Ling looked at his face. He did not turn back. From this angle, he had grown a lot of stubble on his jawline. He had really lost too much weight. She no longer leaned against the side of the bed. Instead, she placed one hand on the edge of the bed and looked at him with watery eyes. Her voice sounded calm, but she deliberately raised the last syllable. What do I look like when I'm drunk? That makes you so obsessed with getting me drunk. Li Nanheng, don't avoid my topic. Perhaps you can think of it this way. Perhaps I came here to see you alive again, and to settle the score with you? Chapter 1374. The room was too quiet. If it weren't for the fact that Feng Ling had been chattering nonstop, the room would have been completely silent. However, Feng Ling, who usually didn't speak much, was like a chatterbox right now. She kept talking, as though she was afraid that he would be gone in the next moment, afraid that he wouldn't be able to hear her, and as though she didn't want everything to be too quiet. If it was quiet, it wouldn't be real enough. She couldn't be sure that she was awake, or that he was alive. So, what do I look like when I'm drunk? Do I talk to you a lot? That's why you know that I need that financing? That's why you know that the first thing I want to do is to get rid of TMing. So after that night, you helped me achieve it one by one? Did I tell you all of this at the time? What else? Do you like me when I'm drunk? Which side of me do you like? If you're not seriously injured and need someone to take care of you, I can drink 2 bottles of wine in front of you at any time. You can do whatever you want. She didn't know which part of her words had touched his sore spot, but the man's fingers that had been quietly placed by his side moved. Feng Ling looked at his hand and reached out to touch it. However, she saw that he retracted his fingers and clenched them into a fist. He did not intend to shake her hand. Feng Ling looked at his hand for a while, but didn't touch it again. She looked at him and said generously, "Forget it. You're a patient. It's inevitable that you have a temper when you're in a bad mood. I won't argue with you." Late at night. Li Nanheng, do you want some water? Boss Li, will your back be sore from lying down? Li Nanheng, are you asleep? Li Nanheng, I suddenly thought of a particularly boring and serious question. These days, you've been coughing up blood every day, and your clothes are covered in blood. You've been frequently changed to wipe your body. Was it that Carrie who wiped it for you? So she saw you naked? Finally, the man who had been silent for the entire night frowned silently and said hoarsely, "She's a doctor." Hearing that he actually opened his mouth to explain, Feng Ling stood by the bed and looked at him without speaking for a while. The woman who had been talking the whole night suddenly quietened down. The atmosphere was so serious that it was a little strange. The man on the bed was silent for a moment before he opened his unfocused eyes and glanced at Feng Ling. Feng Ling looked into his eyes. Even though their eyes met, he couldn't see her. However, she still stared into his eyes and said, "All these years, you've really kept yourself clean. Other than Feng Mingzhu's wishful thinking, you've never given me any chance to be jealous. But now I'm really jealous." She was clearly saying that she was jealous, but there was a little bit of success in her tone. It was obvious that she was a little proud that she had finally forced him to speak. Li Nanheng's cold face returned to its expressionless and unresponsive state. He did not say a word. Coincidentally, Feng Ling's phone vibrated. She picked it up and saw that it was a message from Tam. They had already learned that Boss Li and Kay were here and were preparing to break through the border of Jerusalem at dawn. At the same time, they had already notified the Hall of 11 base. After reading the message, Feng Ling put down her phone and looked at the man on the bed. When the base received the news, they would definitely rush over immediately. Whether Li Nanheng was willing or not, even if they had to carry him, Ah Feng, Han Jin, and the others would come and carry him onto the plane. However, in a place like Israel, wherever a helicopter passed by, it would cause quite a commotion and fear. She thought for a moment and sent them a message, telling them to be careful when they arrived and not scare the people of Gorkin Farm. The people here were frightened by the war, but they were kind and simple. After all, they had saved Li Nanheng and Kay's lives. Feng Ling hoped that they would come clean and leave clean. She didn't want to cause too much impact on the people here. In the morning, it rained for an entire night. The air in Gorkin Farm was moist and no longer so dry. Many people here had woken up early and were walking back and forth outside. Feng Ling heard the sound and woke up. She lay by the bed all night. When she woke up, she saw that Li Nanheng was sleeping. She quickly got up and touched his forehead and neck to check if his arteries and heartbeat were still there. In the end, the sleeping man woke up because of her actions. Although he did not open his eyes, he said lightly, "There's no need to check. He's still alive." His voice was very soft and low, but these few words made Feng Ling's heart, which had been hanging slightly when she had just woken up, instantly relax. She retracted her hand and looked at the man with his eyes closed. She said, "Tam and the others have already contacted the base. Based on the time and speed of the plane, the base's helicopter will arrive before noon." Li Nanheng did not respond, but his brows were clearly furrowed. It seemed like he did not want to be picked up by the base in such a state. At this moment, Feng Ling turned around and looked around the small room. She found the white rice that Carrie had asked for from Granny Mai. The people of Gorkin Farm rarely ate this white rice. After all, Granny Mai was from China, so she would occasionally buy some from passing merchants and store it at home. Feng Ling did not know how to cook other food here. Thankfully, there was some white rice that could be used to cook some porridge for him to eat. Less than an hour later, the room was filled with the fragrance of porridge. Feng Ling went to get a bowl of porridge for him and helped him up like last night. At this moment, Li Nanheng clearly knew that it was useless to resist. Even though his attitude was still cold and distant, he did not do anything in vain. She helped him up, and he cooperated. He did not speak, but at least he was willing to eat the porridge she fed him. The porridge had just been cooked and was still very hot. Before Feng Ling fed him, she would blow on it a few times and gently touch it with her lips to test the temperature. There were a few times when she was scalded and trembled. The man on the bed clearly felt her movements and silently raised his unfocused eyes to look at her. After feeding him a bowl, she asked him if he wanted more. The man was silent at first, but a few seconds later he nodded. Feng Ling quickly went to get another bowl, but when she returned to the bed to feed him, he did not eat. This porridge couldn't be wasted. Seeing that he didn't eat, Feng Ling sat by the bed and ate a few mouthfuls with the spoon and bowl he had used. After eating a few mouthfuls, she turned to look at the man sitting quietly by the bed and finally realized what was going on. He had wanted her to eat some of it in the first place. Io, my little wife has been too clingy these days. I can't take it. Chapter 1375. It was not noon. To be precise, it was 10 o'clock in the morning at Gorkin Farm. Two heavy helicopters flew through the clear sky after the rain and headed straight for Gorkin Farm. Because they had received Tam's reminder not to alarm the people here, the helicopter stopped in the open space near Gorkin Farm. However, it still attracted the surprise of many locals. Some people thought that the war had spread here again, and when they saw the helicopter, they ran home in fright. Tam and Lin Cheng had already arrived by car. Ah Feng and Han Jin brought a few elite members of the base out of the cabin door. When they saw Tam and Lin Cheng, their expressions shifted between them. As members of the sniper team, they did not listen to the base's orders and violated the base's regulations. No matter what the reason was, no matter whether they had contributed or not, according to the base's standards, the two of them were now sinners of the base. However, no one treated them as sinners. Instead, they quickly walked forward and asked, "Boss, where are they now?" Feng Ling sent us the coordinates. They're inside. Tam and the others rushed in. However, because they had alarmed the locals of Gorkin Farm, many locals had already gone home to grab their weapons, wooden sticks, shovels, and all sorts of other things. Feng Ling had indeed reminded them in a text message, but Tam and the others had come in a hurry. Furthermore, Feng Ling had been taking care of Li Nanheng last night, and had not taken the time to go to Granny Mai's place to ask her to help greet the people in the town. Li Nanheng slept again after taking the medicine in the morning. His stamina could not hold on for too long. Every time he woke up, he would continue to sleep for less than an hour. Thankfully, in the past 2 days, Dr. Mona had been here, and his coughing up blood had lessened a lot. Other than occasionally coughing up some blood foam, he had injured his internal organs. These were unavoidable, and it was good to see him improve in the past 2 days. There was a commotion outside, as though something big had happened. Feng Ling sat in the small room, and did not move. When she heard the sound, she glanced out, and was guessing if the people from the base and Tam had arrived. At this moment Carrie ran back from outside. When she saw Feng Ling, her expression suddenly turned awkward. She hesitated for a moment before asking, "Is the helicopter outside looking for you?" Feng Ling stood up. She calculated the time, and realized that it was indeed time to arrive. Yes, she didn't expect the man she saved to have such a powerful background. He even had a helicopter, and the people who came seemed to be well trained. They didn't have any intention of hurting or disrespecting the people here. They only said that they were looking for someone and mentioned Feng Ling, Li Nanheng and Kei's names. The names of these 3 people had been circulating in the Gorkin farm recently. After all, they were 3 outsiders. Everyone would often discuss them quietly. When they suddenly heard their names, they knew that they were indeed here to pick someone up. However, the Israelis had a natural fear of helicopters. Even though they knew the other party's intentions, they were still very vigilant. Many people guarded the entrance of Gorkin farm, and stared at those people. "Who are you people?" Seeing Feng Ling's calm expression, Carrie glanced at her, and then at the man who was still sleeping on the bed. "Who is he?" "He is Li Nanheng." Feng Ling did not explain further. Seeing that Feng Ling didn't seem to want to reveal their identities, Carrie's eyes turned red. "So you're leaving now?" Although Feng Ling wanted to hurry up and ask them to send Li Nanheng back to America to find the best hospital for treatment, she glanced at Carrie and thought for a moment before saying, "Miss Carrie, I'm very grateful to you for saving my life. I'm also grateful to the people of Gorkin Farm for their tolerance of us. If you need anything, you can send it to me when we leave, or when we return. We'll send it to you according to your needs, or..." Carrie stared at her in a daze for a long time. She didn't know what she was thinking. After a while, she waited for Dr. Mona to leave before saying, "The people living here don't want to be affected by the war, so they can only hide in this place. They don't dare to go anywhere, not even Jerusalem, so there's no way they can leave." Hearing her words, Feng Ling looked at her quietly, waiting for her to speak. "My grandfather has passed away, and my parents died in an attack on their way to Jerusalem to do business. I've been living with my grandmother on Gorkin Farm, but I know that my grandmother was in China when she was young. I've heard many stories about China since I was young. I think while my grandmother can still walk, I'll accompany her to China for a walk. Is that okay?" The polite and indifferent expression in Feng Ling's eyes was gradually replaced by warmth. "Yes. Really? Really? Then If you want to leave now, we can take you away from Israel, and then send someone to send you safely to Granny Mai's hometown when she was young." At this moment, Granny Mai happened to walk in, and suddenly heard Feng Ling's words. Her gaze fell on her and Carrie. She looked back and forth for a long time, and seemed a little excited. "What are you talking about?" Carrie excitedly turned around to talk to her grandmother. The grandmother and granddaughter would occasionally communicate in Chinese, and occasionally speak the local language out of habit. However, from her tone, it could be heard that Carrie was really happy. Granny Mai was also excited and in disbelief. Feng Ling thought that perhaps it was really difficult for people who lived in such a war-torn country to leave this land. Coincidentally, she felt that she owed Granny Mai and Carrie a favor. It was a good thing that she could give them the greatest satisfaction in this way. There would be no regrets for both of them. After Ah Feng and the others explained to the people of Gorkin Farm, they could finally enter. They tried their best not to barge in or disturb the people. First, they went to the doctor's place to find Kei. Before Kei could react, he was carried onto the plane by a group of brothers. After entering the plane, he was safely put down and laid down. Only then did he react. He was so excited that his eyes turned red. When they arrived at Carrie's residence, the courtyard door was open, and Li Nanheng had just woken up. However, when he woke up, he seemed to be too weak and did not know what was happening outside. Feng Ling heard the uniform footsteps in the courtyard and turned to open the door. Feng and Han Jin had already led a group of elites from the base to stand in 2 rows in the courtyard. They were all looking in the direction of the door. Chapter 1376. Seeing that it was Feng Ling who opened the door, Feng and Han Jin walked toward the door. Feng Ling stood in front of the door and did not move. She looked at them indifferently. Feng was silent for a moment. He suddenly raised his hand and saluted Feng Ling, expressing his apology, his gratitude, and all his emotions. Because she did not give up. She had really found them. Feng Ling did not say anything. She took a step back and made way for them. When Han Jin and Feng walked in quickly and walked past her, she only said, "Be gentle. Don't startle him." Han Jin. Feng. Wasn't this what Li Nanheng used to say when Feng Ling was asleep? However, when they walked in and looked up, they saw the man lying on the bed. The 2 of them were instantly speechless. Li Nanheng was so thin that he seemed to have become a different person. His once tall and sturdy figure was now thin, and his face was pale. If it weren't for the fact that the man on the bed had guessed the current situation with a cold expression, if his expression could be gentler, he could be considered a handsome young man. He was definitely the thin and gentle type. Unfortunately, even though he was so injured and weak, the coldness in Li Nanheng's unfocused eyes still caused one to shiver instinctively. "Boss!" Han Jin hurriedly walked forward, wanting to see how badly he was injured. Li Nanheng raised his hand and waved Han Jin's hand away. He raised his eyes aimlessly and looked around as though he was searching for something. Seeing that he really couldn't see, Han Jin and Feng, who had already known some news before coming, immediately exchanged glances. His eyes really needed treatment, but they didn't know if they could be cured. Thankfully, Feng Ling discovered it early. Otherwise, if he were to be delayed in this place for another 10 days to half a month or a year, boss would really be crippled here. Feng looked out and saw Granny Mai, Carrie, and many curious onlookers outside the yard. Because of Feng Ling's request, he could not be too rude to them. Regardless of whether their language was the same or not, it was not convenient to say too much here. "Help boss onto the plane first. We'll talk later." Feng gave the elites of the base a look as he spoke. When the elite members of the base quickly walked in, they all looked a little excited when they saw their boss, but they didn't dare to say anything and hurriedly went forward to help him up. After all, they were already here. Li Nanheng understood that no matter what he said or did, he couldn't get Feng Ling and the people of the base away, so he didn't speak. When he was carefully helped up by several people, seeing that boss couldn't even stand steadily, Han Jin rushed forward. "Boss, slow down you guys. Boss has yet to recover from his injuries. Do you think he'll still be able to do as he pleases?" Be gentle, Han Jin reminded him in a low voice as he helped him up. Li Nanheng didn't mind. His expression didn't change much until he was helped out by a few people. He hadn't seen the sun for several days. When he felt the sunlight after the rain outside, he paused slightly. Feng Ling had just put away some of the clothes he had worn on the bed and walked out. When she saw him pause, she didn't know why, but she instinctively felt that even if his eyes couldn't see, he must be able to feel light. Or perhaps he could see a little bit of light. Before leaving, Li Nanheng followed Han Jin's hint and found where Carrie and Granny Mai were standing. Even though he didn't have much strength, he still slowly bowed in their direction to express his gratitude. Carrie's hands tightly gripped the cuffs of her cotton dress. This man was indeed very good-looking. Even though he was pale and haggard, when the sun shone on his face, she felt as though his entire body was covered in a layer of light. However, she knew very well that this kind of person didn't belong to the same world as her. Because of saving this man, she and her grandmother were sent out of Israel by these powerful people, and could help her and her grandmother realize their dream of safely returning to China. This was really a pleasant surprise. After all, they saved Yurin-K's lives. "We definitely won't mistreat them. We'll make appropriate arrangements," Han Jin said. Li Nanheng nodded indifferently. Seeing that he couldn't hold on any longer, Afong gestured for them to send him onto the plane. This place was about a few hundred meters away from where the helicopter was parked. Fortunately, the elite team members were very fast, and their hands were very steady. After helping Li Nanheng onto the plane, there was already a soft bed prepared in the cabin. They quickly helped him lie down. Feng Ling told Afong about Carrie and Granny Mai's situation. Afong asked someone to help the grandmother and granddaughter pack their things and bring them away now. If they wanted to leave, they had to leave now. If they were late, they could not guarantee the safety of anyone in this country. Less than an hour later, 2 heavy-duty helicopters took off above Gorkin Farm. Granny Mai and Carrie were invited to another plane. There were several elites in the base who would take care of them. After leaving Israel, they would send them to a safe airport and help them apply for their identity, household registration, passports, and so on. It would be convenient for them to fly back to China. They would also leave them a large sum of money so that they could live a stable life after returning to China. In this plane, Kay was originally lying inside. When he heard that Boss had also boarded the plane, he was so anxious that he wanted to get up several times, but he was held down by Tam and Lin Chung. They told him to rest first. After they returned, both of them would be admitted to the hospital for treatment. However, Kay still struggled to get up and looked at the front of the cabin. In the direction Han Jin and Ah Feng's bodies were blocking, he still saw Li Nanheng, who had almost died from his serious injuries. Seeing that Boss had lost a lot of weight, he blamed himself even more. Feng Ling received Kay's gaze and walked over to say, "Lie down properly. Why are you sitting up? I want to see Boss. We'll see when we go back. He needs to rest." From the looks of it, although Kay's leg was broken, at least his internal injuries were not as serious as Li Nanheng's. Kay could still occasionally stay awake for a few hours, but Li Nanheng needed a long time to rest. His stamina and mental state could not bear it for too long. While Feng Ling was talking to Kay, Li Nanheng, who was surrounded by a few people, was lying on the soft bed in the cabin with his eyes closed. He frowned because of the questions from the people around him. Han Jin glared at the elite members until they stopped by the bed. He quickly reached out to help Li Nanheng change his clothes. Li Nanheng raised his hand to stop him and said in a low voice, "I'll change when we go back. There's no hurry." Chapter 1377. Seeing that Boss finally spoke, Han Jin's hand paused. "All right, then let's go back and change. According to the current weather and the speed of the plane, it will take at least 7 or 8 hours for us to fly back to Los Angeles. There's no doctor on the plane now. Boss, if you're not feeling well, we can. It's okay. I can endure it." After Li Nanheng said this, he clearly didn't have much strength left. He frowned slightly. It should be because he had just been forcibly carried out of the house and boarded the plane. The air pressure at high altitudes was unstable. Right now he was no different from a paper man. The slightest fluctuation, and the trembling of the plane in the airflow, could make him feel uncomfortable. A week later, Los Angeles. Li Nanheng and Kay had been rushed to the hospital for treatment. They had been in the hospital for 6 days. Both of them needed various tests because of chemical poisoning. Their bodies were a little swollen, due to the high air pressure on the way back, and their bodies occasionally turned blue. Especially when Li Nanheng was injured in order to save Kay. There were many chemical components in his blood that needed to be tested. After being quarantined and taken care of by more than 10 medical experts for several days, good news finally came. Those chemical poisons were only released in countries at war to stimulate the central nervous system of the local residents and enemies. Although the poisonous smoke was very heavy, fortunately, they had entered the water quickly. Because of the explosion, their bodies were more or less affected by the chemical poisonous smoke. However, after professional serum treatment and detoxification therapy, within a few days, Kay and Li Nanheng's nervous systems gradually recovered their normal functions. Furthermore, when they had just been saved by the people of Gorkin Farm, the medicine used by the local doctor was indeed very effective. It could block the poison that had accumulated in their bodies and almost entered their internal organs. Those medicines were all used by the local doctor. But perhaps the people of countries at war had their own methods to save themselves. The medicine they used was actually very effective. If they hadn't been urgently treated there at that time, even if they were sent back to America, they might not have been able to expel the chemical ingredients so cleanly. It could be considered a close shave, but it was an indisputable fact that Kay had lost a leg. Fortunately, Kay was the one who was saved by Boss. Now he was in a good mood. At most, he would get a prosthetic leg in the future. No matter what, he could live well. Only Li Nanheng's eyes. The doctor said that there was only a 50% chance of recovering his vision. Because he had to find Kay's location when saving him. A normal person should have subconsciously closed their eyes to avoid it. But at that time, he had been searching for Kay with his eyes open, and was injured by the poisonous smoke containing chemicals. But after all, this kind of blindness was caused by external forces, not natural blindness. In this kind of situation, there was usually a certain possibility of recovering one's vision, but no one knew when it would recover, or if there was a chance for it to really recover. Kay had been transferred to a general ward, and didn't need to continue to be inserted with tubes in the ICU. This hospital had been sealed inside and out, and only the members of the base could enter and exit. After another week, Li Nanheng was successfully transferred to a general ward like Kay, but he still needed medical staff to guard outside 24 hours a day. Fortunately, visitors were allowed to leave the ward at will. In the past half a month, Feng Ling had not entered Li Nanheng's ward. Previously, she only allowed one person to visit him for at most an hour a day. This visiting opportunity was also given to Ah Feng. After all, Ah Feng had to explain many things to Li Nanheng. He also had to report the search situation of the base, and the specific casualties to Li Nanheng. In just half a month, it seemed like more than 10 years. Feng Ling stood outside Li Nanheng's ward. After waiting for a moment, she saw Ah Feng, who had just visited him as usual, open the door and walk out. As soon as he saw Feng Ling standing outside, he walked over and asked her with his eyes if she wanted to go in. "Are you awake?" Feng Ling asked indifferently. Feng Ling had never been the kind of person who put her emotions on the surface. In the past few days, she knew that Li Nanheng was here, but she did not come here in vain to fight for the opportunity to visit him, nor did she beg the doctor for anything. She just waited quietly. "He's awake. Do you want to go in?" Ah Feng did not say much. He only smiled lightly and looked at her. Back then, even the brothers in the base had given up, but Feng Ling, who was far away in New York, did not give up. In the end, she did go to find Boss personally, but after successfully bringing him back to the United States, she stood quietly by the side and did not step forward to make any sense of existence. Ah Feng felt ashamed of himself. Feng Ling nodded. Ah Feng smiled and made an inviting gesture. Feng Ling walked in. The door of the ward opened and closed. A man in a light-colored hospital gown was sitting on the bed. Sunlight shone in through the window and fell on his body. The man's hair had grown a little longer, because he hadn't taken care of it for nearly a month. In the past, his hair was neat and short, but now it looked clean and stuck to his body. It felt a little soothing. Especially when the sun shone on him like this, he looked warm and cozy. There was a white gauze wrapped around his head from his eyes to the back of his head. It was not very tight, and from this angle, she could see that the gauze around his eyes was a little brown because of the medicine. She did not speak after entering the ward. Li Nanheng's keen senses were enough for him to notice that someone had entered. She did not speak, so he looked in her direction. They looked at each other for nearly a minute. For so many days, Feng Ling had not tried to come in to see him, and Li Nanheng had not asked about her. The woman who had taken the initiative to disappear from his side, after sending him back to the United States, entered the ward. Li Nanheng seemed to want to use the sunlight in the ward to find some direction. But at this moment, he suddenly heard approaching footsteps. When he felt that someone was suddenly approaching, he raised his cold brows. Before he could speak, he suddenly felt a warm and soft touch on his lips. Li Nanheng's eyebrows twitched at this moment. If his nervous system had recovered, and his senses were not confused, did Feng Ling kiss him as soon as she came in? It was not a kiss. She didn't move away. Instead, she gently sucked on his lips. Li Nanheng's eyebrows twitched again. He subconsciously wanted to retreat, but the woman in front of him grabbed his collar and forced him to retreat. She deepened the kiss. Chapter 1378. The touch on his lips was warm and familiar. It was unbelievably soft, and she had never taken the initiative before. It was as if he was as strong as before, not allowing her to refuse or retreat. She gripped his collar and deepened it again and again. When almost half of Feng Ling's body was leaning against the hospital bed, she simply pressed half of her body against him. If it weren't for the fact that the wounds on his body had mostly healed, and he couldn't bear any weight for the time being, she might have pressed him against the bed and pressed him up again. Feng Ling did not say a word. After coming in, she kissed him for a long time. After an unknown period of time. Was it about 3 minutes? Or 5 minutes? She slowly moved her lips away from his lips that had turned from cold to warm. But she didn't move far away. Her hand was still holding his neckline, and she looked down at Li Nanheng, who was sitting motionless on the bed with his eyes blindfolded. At this moment, it was clear that his facial expression hadn't completely recovered. After looking at him for a long time, Feng Ling slowly moved her lips. She stared at his face and said clearly, "Your mouth is filled with the taste of medicine. What have you been eating these days?" Li Nanheng did not move. It was as if he instinctively felt that ever since he was injured in Israel and Feng Ling found him, she seemed to have changed from the cold and quiet Feng Ling to another person. She was proactive and determined, making him a little uncomfortable. Even though he couldn't see it with his eyes blindfolded, he could feel that she had been staring at him from a close distance. The man suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. He coughed as though he was clearing his throat. He turned his head slightly and said hoarsely, "The doctor said I can only eat liquid food." It meant that he had been drinking porridge or soup without oil or salt these days. No wonder there was no taste in his mouth. The only taste was the medicine he had to drink 4 or 5 times a day from morning to night. Li Nanheng's body had been severely damaged by the chemical smoke explosion in Israel. Putting aside when his eyes would recover, it would take at least a year and a half for his body to completely return to its previous state. Thankfully, Li Nanheng had a strong physique since he was young. Under such a fatal danger, he was able to survive. After being brought back to the United States, he had been treated for so many days, washed his lungs and cleared his blood. There were also many emergency measures that non-professional medical personnel could not name. Of course, many people said that money could indeed do whatever you wanted. This was clearly reflected in the matter of saving lives in the hospital. The more expensive the medicine, the more expensive the medicine. Whether it was the base or the Li family, they were all thinking of ways to send money over. As long as they could save Li Nanheng healthy, they could even move a mountain of gold to the hospital. Li Nanheng, whose physical fitness had always been very strong, gave them a lot of face. After half a month of uninterrupted treatment, he could be transferred to a general ward more than 10 days earlier than the doctor had expected. Although he was still very weak and was still pale and thin because he could only eat liquid food every day, at least the doctor had given them a very positive answer. He had said that his physical condition was very good. As long as he recuperated for a year and a half in regular systematic rehabilitation, he would definitely be able to return to his previous state after a complete recovery. He would still be the boss Li who had beaten the terrorists like a wolf and a tiger in front of them. This was the best news everyone had heard in the past few days. Kay's condition was also recovering well. The only pity was that he had lost a leg. But Kay's mental state had already adjusted very well. He had seen too many life and death situations. He knew that as long as he survived, it would be a blessing. Feng Ling had not entered Li Nanheng's ward for the past few days. These days, Feng Ling had not entered Li Nanheng's ward. She was just waiting, patiently waiting for Li Nanheng, who was as strong as his body, to face her calmly in this temporarily invisible state. But obviously in this matter, maybe she really should take the initiative. Feng Ling looked at him and stared at the 2 healed wounds on the side of his face and forehead. There were more wounds on his body, but at least new skin and flesh had grown out and were healing. In the face of modern medical technology, as long as there was enough money, it was very easy to remove scars. However, Feng Ling felt that every wound on Li Nanheng's body seemed to be engraved with the course of this man's life. The doctor has confirmed that your body can recover. It just needs some time. Feng Ling was so close to him, and even deliberately spoke to his lips. Li Nanheng, even if you want to die now, I'm afraid it won't be so easy. Do you still refuse to acknowledge me? Perhaps because Feng Ling took the initiative and spoke in a teasing tone, Li Nanheng was stunned for a moment. His eyes were covered with gauze, and she couldn't see the emotions in his eyes. She looked at his face and waited unhurriedly for him to speak again. If Li Nanheng could see now, he would see Feng Ling propping her hands on his hospital bed and leaning over to look at him sitting on the bed at a close distance. There seemed to be light in her eyes, with the passion and persistence that she used to have when she was drunk, and there was a faint expectation hidden under the surface of the persistence. This scene was like a female entrepreneur who, in order to get a man, did not hesitate to injure and lock him in a certain hospital, and then she came to force him to submit. Of course, the premise was that he could see. He couldn't see right now. He didn't know if Feng Ling was sitting or standing right now. He could only feel her eyes on him. Li Nanheng's movements were a little slow as he turned his face to her. It seemed that he wanted to make sure that she was in front of him and look at her through a layer of medical gauze. As if he had really seen her, Feng Ling faced him and slightly raised her beautiful eyebrows. Why didn't you take the initiative in the past? The man spoke. His expression was still expressionless, but his voice was no longer so heavy. The smile in Feng Ling's eyes finally rose. Coincidentally, he couldn't see it, so she didn't hide her smile. It's probably because the two of us are always a strong combination. Both of us have a hard bone and won't give in to each other. It's rare that you're so weak that you can't even beat a finger of mine. My overflowing sympathy and the deep affection you forced into me over the years suddenly surged. I can't hold it back for a moment. The man's brows moved imperceptibly. He did not speak, but it was clear that he was very convinced by her words. Chapter 1379. Besides, I was the one who brought your life back. If I don't take the initiative, what if you look for Carrie after you can see? Wouldn't I lose more than I gain? As Feng Ling spoke, she reached out to stroke his collar, smoothing out the crease she had just made. Li Nanheng seemed to be puzzled for a moment. Do you have a deep impression of this, Carrie? Do you feel a sense of danger from her existence? If I had known that you would change so much just by being jealous, I would have arranged for a few more women to be by my side. The man spoke shamelessly, but because of his thin and pale state, he looked so harmless when he said these shameless words. Feng Ling. That's different. The man looked at her and did not speak, but it was clear that he wanted to know what was different about her. Take Feng Mingzhu for example. A person's unilateral initiative and love don't constitute anything. Outstanding people never lack suitors, so even if other women appear by your side, as long as they don't like you, I have nothing to be jealous of. Feng Ling's voice was cold. But Carrie saved you. I have to admit that if she hadn't brought you back, would you have died there? And later on she did blush at you. For a young girl to have such a state, it means that she is very superficial and has fallen in love with your appearance, who she has only known for a few days. Furthermore, she has seen you naked. Li Nanheng did not speak for a while. He seemed to be thinking carefully about this question. He was thinking about whether Carrie was really worth his consideration. Seeing that he was actually thinking seriously, Feng Ling's expression paused, and she stared at him. From what you said earlier, I can only conclude 3 points. First, I'm very outstanding. The man's voice was quiet, but he said something that would not make him blush at all. Second, even though I'm injured to this extent, my looks are still at their peak. Feng Ling. Thirdly, you're still brooding over the fact that I've been seen naked by another woman. Her expression was cold. If a man saw me naked, would you want to dig out his eyes? Li Nanheng smiled and did not answer her. Instead, he said, So you've already helped me repay the favor I owed when I was saved at Gorkin Farm, haven't you? He seemed to have found a more comfortable sitting position on the bed, and could only rest on the hospital bed every day. These days, Li Nanheng was used to this slow pace of life. Perhaps because he had just experienced a life-and-death disaster. His voice was much gentler and calmer. At least, although he was still very shameless just now, he was not particularly asking for a beating. First of all, you didn't gouge her eyes out. Secondly, you personally helped her and her grandmother arrange a trip back to China, including the funds. You helped them realize their dream of returning to a peaceful world from a war-torn land. With this, you've successfully made up for the debt between us. From now on, there won't be any debt of gratitude between us. If I go to find someone to repay my debt of gratitude now, it'll be superfluous. It'll be even more impossible for us to have any contact in the future. Although I've been seen naked, I was injured and covered in blood at that time. It's not a loss for me to be seen by a doctor. If you really feel bad, after I recover, I'll use disinfectant to wash my body 49 times. What do you think? When Feng Ling agreed to send the grandmother and granddaughter back to China, she only wanted to repay their kindness. She did not think too much about it. Li Nanheng's words instantly smoothed out the small knot in her heart that had just emerged. At this moment, Feng Ling's phone suddenly vibrated in her pocket. Although Li Nanheng could not see, when people closed their eyes, their other senses were very sensitive, especially their ears. Hearing that her phone was vibrating, he did not say anything. He was clearly waiting for her to answer the call. The phone vibrated for a long time before Feng Ling took it out of her pocket and looked at it. Seeing that it was Qin Shuk, she picked it up. How is it? Is Li Nanheng out of danger? I really can't go to Los Angeles to see you. If there's anything, you have to tell me. Don't hold it in alone. I understand you very well. You're always like this. You're used to enduring your emotions without batting an eyelid. For example, you actually love him no less than Li Nanheng, but you just don't want to express it. If it weren't for the fact that something happened to him and forced you to run to Israel without any regard for your own safety, even I would have suspected if your heart was made of stone. But in the end, your heart is actually softer than anyone else. It's just that the defenses and walls you erected outside your own world are too high. The ward was very quiet. Even the windows were closed. The sound of her phone was not loud, but it was precisely because it was too quiet that Qin Shuk's grumbling voice clearly reached the man's ears. Feng Ling paused. She wanted to stop Qin Shuk from saying anything, but it was too late. She heard Qin Shuk say, "Also, what do you mean by the silver nameplates you gave me before you left?" At that time, I didn't know at all. 2 days ago, I took the time to send a message to one of Kay's brothers in the base. Only then did I know that handing over those nameplates meant that you were going to participate in a battle that you might not be able to return from. After you die, I'll send these things to the base to comfort your heroic souls. Did you go to Israel with the thought that you might not be able to return? If Li Nanheng knew that you risked your life to go to Israel to find him, and even gave me the nameplates, would he explode in anger? Feng Ling, why do you have so much to say? What's wrong? Aren't I usually like this? Feng Ling hung up the phone. When she placed it in her pocket, she thought for a moment and turned off the phone. When she raised her eyes again, she saw that Li Nanheng was still sitting quietly on the hospital bed. She could not see his eyes, nor could she see any changes in his expression. Feng Ling thought for a moment. Seeing that there was no water by his bedside, she asked, "How long have you been awake? When Ah Feng was here, he kept talking to you. Didn't he pour you water?" With that, she turned around to pour a cup of warm water. She tested the temperature herself and confirmed that it was just right. She walked back to the bed and handed the cup to him. The man's fingers moved, and with the help of the touch, he smoothly took the cup. Chapter 1380. However, after he took the cup of water, he didn't drink it, nor did he do anything else. He just sat there with the cup of water in his hand. He didn't look at her, but instead said faintly and slowly, "You went to Israel with the intention of never returning?" As expected, he heard it. Feng Ling did not answer. She only reached out to push his hand that was holding the glass of water. Drink some water. He did not move. He held the glass of water and said, If you couldn't find me in Israel for so many days, what would you do? Feng Ling was silent for a moment. But I found you. If you couldn't find me? Li Nanhing's tone sounded very light. Perhaps because his body was too weak, he couldn't be too sonorous. But even his soft words seemed to be powerful in the quiet ward at this moment. Come on, let's make a hypothetical question. If you still can't find it after such a long time, what will you do? Not return to America? Just keep searching like this? Even though you know how chaotic that place is, that there are wars everywhere, that it's barren, and that it might be hit by an airdrop bomb from the sky at any time, you still have to look for me with the thought of never returning? As the man spoke, he placed the glass of water on the blanket covering his legs. He only held it with his hand and did not drink it. Feng Ling did not want to answer this hypothetical question, but she saw that he did not intend to easily ignore this topic. A place like Israel was indeed not a simple country. There were wars everywhere, and it was indeed a country where one step in and one would die. If I can't find you, I'll keep searching, Feng Ling said sincerely. I can search every inch of Jerusalem. I even dare to enter the ancient jungle. If I can't find you in 1 year, I'll search for 2 years. If I can't find you in 2 years, I'll search for 10 years. In short, the light in my life begins when someone walks into my world. I will always look in the direction of that light. Even if I have to search for my entire life, I won't give up. After speaking, she looked at Li Nanheng and instinctively felt that she had never said such sour words to him. She didn't know how he would react after hearing this. Would he be very touched, and then regretted that he had avoided her in Israel a few days ago? Or they would say that she was a simple-minded person, reprimanding her, that she shouldn't have such a stubborn way of thinking, and that she should live a good life and so on. In short, she had already thought of what she was going to say next, and had already prepared a draft in her mind. In the end, Li Nanheng only slowly picked up the glass, took a sip of the slightly cold water, and put it down. He said very calmly, The doctor said that I should go home to rest after leaving the hospital. The Li family has already planned to send a car to pick me up in a few days and send 8 or 10 people to guard my bed. I will enjoy the treatment of having my clothes stretched out and food opened by my mouth. Feng Ling? Why did he suddenly change the topic? In the next sentence, Li Nanheng said lightly, It's rare for you to be so affectionate to me, and you can't control your excitement and want to confess to me. I've decided not to return to the Li family. I'll be merciful and go to your place to recuperate. I'll let you enjoy the treatment of having me alone. Feng Ling, don't you still have an apartment in Los Angeles? Get someone to tidy it up and add some daily necessities. You can move in directly. The apartment space isn't small. I won't mind living there. Let's go there. Feng Ling gradually reacted from Li Nanheng's strange thoughts. Are you talking about the apartment you bought for me? Isn't your apartment above my apartment? What's the difference between this and you going back to your own home? There's indeed no difference. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. The man took another sip of water and didn't mention it again, as though this matter had been decided. He handed the glass of water to her. It's cold. Help me change it to a warm one. Feng Ling thought she had heard wrongly. Shouldn't he be very touched? The result of being touched was for her to take care of him, while he recuperated. This meant that she didn't have to consider returning to the phone corporation for the time being. She definitely wouldn't have the time to go back. She didn't have to consider the base or anyone else's matters. She just had to focus on accompanying him at home to recuperate. He was recuperating, and she was on vacation? Feng Ling did not move for a long time. Li Nanheng's brows twitched. Earlier, you said that it would be a year, 10 years, or even a lifetime. Now, you're not even willing to pour me another glass of water? Feng Ling silently walked forward to take the glass of water and glanced at Li Nanheng. All right, a leopard cannot change its spots. He was so injured that he needed a year and a half to recover. Even if he couldn't see, he was still Li Nanheng. The key was that he had clearly learned a new skill. He could display his shamelessness to the fullest, and did not feel particularly out of place. After pouring another glass of warm water, Feng Ling stuffed the glass into his hand. She watched as he took the glass and drank the water. She watched as his Adam's apple moved as he drank the water. She suddenly remembered that night at Mr. Mike's resort in Washington. When she woke up in the middle of the night, she was on him. She remembered that she had bitten his throat. His position seemed to be particularly sensitive. For some reason, she suddenly noticed his Adam's apple. Perhaps it was because he had lost too much weight, and his originally beautiful and sexy Adam's apple was even more obvious than before. Feng Ling looked away, and did not notice that her ears were a little red. Even though Li Nanheng was very active in the treatment, it would still take time for his eyes to recover, including his physical condition. Although his life was definitely saved, his internal organs were injured. In ancient times, internal injuries were internal injuries. Internal injuries were difficult to treat. It was not something that could be cured in a day or two. Everything depended on recuperation. Li Nanheng received absolutely high-standard treatment in the hospital for about a month before he could finally be discharged. The Li family did send a car over, but it was only to send various daily necessities on behalf of elderly. He didn't know how Li Nanheng communicated with the elders of the Li family, but they actually agreed to let him stay at Feng Ling's place alone. They handed over all the work of taking care of him to Feng Ling, who could cook but could not cook more than 3 dishes. Feng also found this unbelievable. Didn't the 4 elders think that Boss would be better taken care of if he returned to the Li family? After all, Boss sometimes even needed someone to help him go to the toilet. However, on the phone, Elder Li's reply to Feng was, "It's okay, as long as he doesn't starve to death." Feng. He put down the phone and silently watched the lucky Li Nanheng get into Feng Ling's car. It's almost the end of the month, right? It's time for the intelligent and beautiful Qing Qing to take off her disguise and start to beg for monthly votes. Chapter 1381. On the way back to the Los Angeles condo, Feng's car naturally followed behind. After all, although Boss was taken away by Feng Ling, there was nothing unsafe about it. The two of them had been entangled for so many years, and Boss Li was personally brought back from Israel by Feng Ling. Nothing would happen to him. However, it was still necessary to see him return to the condo safely with his own eyes. Feng Ling thanked the driver arranged by Feng and drove the G-Series Hummer that Li Nanheng used to drive here. Normally speaking, it would be very strange for a woman with long hair to drive this kind of car. After all, this car was too big and had the rugged nature of a classic car that men loved. However, when Feng Ling drove it, it didn't feel so strange. It was probably because everyone knew how good Feng Ling's driving skills were. They also knew that although she looked like a little woman, she didn't lose to men at all. Especially now, Feng Ling often tied her hair into a ponytail, looking energetic and athletic. She was so young and beautiful that people couldn't take their eyes off her. She was no longer the tomboy she used to be, but the most gentle and beautiful scenery in front of these cars. A few black Hummers followed behind the G-Series Hummer and sped along the road in Los Angeles. Li Nanheng was helped into the car. He sat in the back row. Although he was wearing clothes, his legs were covered with a soft blanket. The gauze wrapped around his eyes to the back of his head had been removed, but because he still needed to change the dressing every day, his eyes were still covered with medical gauze. Furthermore, the doctor said that his eyes needed to be treated because of the blood clot in his brain and the chemical smoke. Right now, his head couldn't be violently hit or touched. He needed to sit there quietly and couldn't show off even if he wanted to. Although he couldn't see, it didn't mean that he couldn't use his phone. He could still answer the phone and listen to the voice message. Feng Ling was focused on driving. At this moment, Li Nanheng's phone on the back seat buzzed twice. The man moved his hand away from the stall slightly, groped for the position of the vibration, picked up the phone, and placed it by his ear. On the phone, Kay's voice came. "Hey boss, are you really going back with Feng Ling alone?" Li Nanheng's expression remained unchanged. "Why? Is there a problem?" "It's not a problem. Kay sat in a Hummer behind. He looked at his brother who was driving and said to the phone with a smile, "I just remembered that when we were in Israel, Fong Ling had been holding back her temper for 2 days. I think it's very irrational for you to go back with her like this." Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows. Before he spoke, Kay continued on the phone. "I mean, boss, don't you remember how you mercilessly said you didn't know her when you thought you couldn't live? Aren't you afraid that she'll hold a grudge against you and settle the score with you when there's no one else around? Look at Fong Ling's temper. Right now she's gentle because you look too weak. She doesn't dare to be too violent, but you know her nature very well. What if she cough? Boss, you understand. I'm just cautiously advising you to avoid this time bomb while you're recuperating. You can flirt with her as you please after you've recovered. Why do you have to risk your life that you've barely managed to get back? Don't you think so?" Just then, there seemed to be 2 cars colliding on the road in front of them. The collision shouldn't be serious, but the rear bumper of the car was smashed to the ground, causing a traffic jam on this normally normal road. Seeing that the road ahead was blocked, Fong Ling got out of the car to take a look. The moment Fong Ling opened the door and got out of the car, Li Nanheng replied calmly, "The person you're talking about who mercilessly refused to acknowledge her, is it me?" Kay's words were suddenly choked in his throat. "How could I do such a stupid thing? You must have remembered wrongly," Li Nanheng said indifferently, and listened to the movements outside the car. At the same time, he listened to the movements outside the car. Fong Ling probably went down to take a look at the situation, and then turned back. He said in a low voice, "Don't care about the reason. If she wants my life, she can take it at any time. She doesn't need a reason." After that, he hung up the phone and put the phone on the back seat in a smooth and natural manner. He continued to put his hands on the blanket on his lap, looking like he was going to sit there obediently and not move. "Kay, Boss Lee, you're really something. You can't even move, but you can still be so serious and shameless." It turned out that he also knew that it was an extremely stupid thing to refuse to acknowledge Fong Ling at that time. Even he didn't want to admit it, right? Kay was so angry that he laughed. He put down his phone and rubbed his forehead. A brother of the elite team, who was driving in front, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Seeing him lying on his side in the back seat of the car, his eyes were filled with a helpless smile. "Brother Kay, I heard from Brother Fong today that the base has gone to New York's largest medical auxiliary equipment factory to order a very flexible prosthesis at a high price. It will be completed in less than a month and sent to you. At that time, you won't be affected when you walk. Brother Fong also said that you should continue to go back to the sniper team for training. He wants you to practice your one-leg balance and arm support. How is it? Is the arrangement perfect?" Hearing this, Kay raised his eyebrows and then smiled. No matter how rich the base is, it's impossible for them to spend a high price to customize a prosthesis for anyone. This money is either paid by Boss Lee or Fong Ling, right? The brother driving the car smiled. "I can only say that you're bound to have good fortune after surviving a disaster. In the future, the actual combat missions of the base won't fall on you. They can even give you an instructor or something. Every day, you'll go teach those hotheads who just came in, show them your prosthesis, and tell them the story of how you once risked your life for the base. Just thinking about it makes me happy." "Happy? Why don't you King crawl out of a pile of dead people and break a leg? Let me exchange with you? Do you like it?" Kay grabbed a bottle of mineral water in the car and smashed it on the back of his head. "Damn it, it hurts." The brother driving the car chuckled, picked up the bottle of mineral water, put it aside, and continued to follow the car in front. When Fong Ling returned to the car, she saw that Li Nanheng had hung up the phone. She didn't hear what he was saying earlier. Seeing that he was sitting there with a normal expression, she didn't know if he was closing his eyes to rest, so she didn't say much. She started the engine, turned the car around, and drove to the other fork in the road. You're tuning into the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.